Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for those of you who have been to all of our 12 Essentials of Freedom Conference. You know that I'm Danny Hozack, and I'm the chairman until you get 1 minute behind schedule, and then John will be chairing the meeting. He's sort of a tough master, but he said I get to do the job as long as we stay on schedule. So one of the things we pride ourselves in is being on schedule, and so we intend to do that today. We do have one quick addition or change to the agenda. Mattea and Merta we're going to try and save 10 minutes. We're going to try and move the agenda up 10 minutes starting, after John's speech, and we're going to shorten the break by 10 minutes. And Mattea and Merta will start at 10:10 instead of 10:20, so that we have 10 minutes for Lieutenant Colonel Redman before the hour of 11, just so he can make some opening remarks before the hour of 11. So for those of you who have been here, you'll have some sympathy for Bob Nielsen's father-in-law and for Bob Nielsen and Colleen, who passed away last Christmas. But in any event, his father-in-law would start out to tell a story, and Colleen would say, "Dad, we've heard this story before." And he'd say, "Well, you're going to hear it again right now." And so I want to start by telling the story of the New York businessman who was rushing downtown to drop off a tender, one of the most important tenders of his life, and he gets downtown, and of course the traffic is terrible. That was when it was still safe to go downtown in New York. But in any event, so anyway, he's looking at his watch, and he only has about 10 minutes left, and he can't find a place to park. And so he stops. He said, "Please, God, help me find a parking spot, and I'll take 10% of the profit from my conference or from my project, and I'll donate it to the church." And he opens his eyes, and there's nothing. So he drives around the block again, and he's getting more and more desperate. And he says, stops and he prays. He said, "Please, God," he said, "help me find a parking spot, and I'll give 20% of the profits to the church, and I'll come to the church every week for sure." And drives around the block, still nothing. So he stops and he says, please, God, help me find a parking spot, and I'll give 30% of the profit to the church, and I'll come at least twice a week, for the next year." And he opened his eyes, and there's a parking spot right there. He just pulls in and parks, and he says, "Never mind, Lord, I found one myself." So, lest any of us think that we're here by accident, I've asked our dear friend Tom Jackson to start by asking an opening prayer. So I think you can just remain seated, and Tom will say the opening prayer. Welcome, Tom. Nice to see you back. We've had a COVID break from seeing you.
Well, thanks everyone very much for coming out this morning. And this is Remembrance Day. So from the bottom of our hearts, we thank our veterans. We thank those who, over the past, have gone and fought for our nation, fought for our freedom, and fought for our grandchildren's freedoms. So let's think about that as we share today in the wisdom of our Lord. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can meet here today in peace in this warm room. We thank you that we can discuss our issues peacefully, the issues that are important to our province and to our nation. Guide us in wisdom, in hope, in peace, that we may be the light of the world on the mountaintop. And we pray that we can share the love of our Lord Jesus Christ with the world as he did for us. Let us do this for our neighbors. Amen.
Thank you, Tom. Well, John, it's your turn, and you get to speak until your 1 minute passed, and then we'll get a new speaker. So anyway, go ahead. Please welcome John Robson.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I fear that my attempts to stage a coup against Danny are unlikely to succeed because he's actually ahead of time. But I did want to mention, when I was a kid, I was very, very fond of dinosaurs, and the best dinosaur just about was the Tyrannosaurus Rex, whose name means Tyrant Lizard King. And I'm the Tyrant Timer King, to carry on that fine tradition. But since I'm not a politician, the problem that this creates is that I have to stay on time myself. That's the unpleasant part of it all. But in a rule-bound society, that is how things have to be done. We need to have rules, and they need to apply to everybody. And we are very much concerned here at all of these conferences with this question of how we maintain a society of liberty under law. That is a society in which freedom can flourish because we are subject neither to tyranny nor to anarchy. And because it's Remembrance Day, I wanted to begin my talk with a line which a number of Canadian journalists have attributed to American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor, in genuine bewilderment, asking, what kind of people do they think we are? In point of fact, it was Winston Churchill who said it, which tells you a little something about Canadian journalists. He was addressing a joint session of Congress, and talking about the Anglosphere generally, he asked of those who had been so foolish as to attack it, what kind of a people do they think we are? And the question that looms over us today in general terms, and at this conference as well, is, are we still that kind of people who, in Churchill's words, will never cease to persevere? And these words have certainly echoed down through the years, and they echo today, I think, among other things, in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have shown themselves to be a kind of people that Vladimir Putin had no idea they might be. And I'm very concerned with what kind of people, not just Vladimir Putin, but Xi Jinping thinks we are. Does he believe it is safe to attack the West? Does he believe, as Hitler believed, and as Hirohito believed, that we are decadent, that we are soft, that we are incapable of resolve, that we cannot withstand pain, and that, faced with adversity, we will collapse? But in some ways, I am less concerned now with what Xi Jinping thinks than with what we ourselves think. I am always worried about our habit of giving foreign tyrants grounds to believe that this would be a good moment to strike at us, because even if they are wrong, the consequences of this miscalculation are terrible. But I am also concerned that at some point they might turn out to be right. Certainly, the collapse of Rome was widely believed, including by the Romans themselves, to be the consequence less of the formidable qualities of their adversaries as the decay in their own characters. So are we still a people able to sustain freedom? And again, I don't mean you in this room. Obviously, you are. That's why you're here. We are the core of the resistance both to overt and to creeping tyranny, the hard kind represented in the Kremlin, and the soft kind that de Tocqueville talked about, this nanny state that does not so much crush as enervates. It covers the whole of society with a network of minute rules and gradually saps our will to resist even the most obviously idiotic things that might be done to us. And since we are commemorating Remembrance Day here in Canada, I want to, if I can work the clicker, there we are, quote a Canadian poet talking about the Second World War, Robert J.C. Steed, says, well may the world read a lesson, well may it learn and be wise. Not to the strong is the battle, not to the swift is the prize. Loud is the boast of the despot, clanking his nation in arms. But beware of a peace-loving people when they sweep from their forests and farms. It was clear to him, as it was clear to Churchill, and they were not wrong, that such a people possessed tremendous fortitude as well as creativity when they were called upon. And I think that we still do, but we shouldn't take it for granted. We need to understand that liberty prevailed throughout the years because people understood that it wasn't free. And so that's why I'm delighted that you have swept from your forests, farms, and possibly your suburban lawns, or even, in some cases, your cubicles to be here at this conference or to be joining us remotely. I don't have a lot of good things to say about the COVID pandemic, but at least we did expand our capacity to have people attend conferences who, for one reason or another, found it difficult physically to be there. And we're here to talk about family and freedom. And there are two critical aspects to this, and I want in this talk to set up what I think are two related, but in some sense opposed aspects of the problem of family and freedom. One of them is fairly directly, how do we protect the family from an overbearing state? This is obviously a major problem in our lives today. The state aspires to supplant parents and to raise children in ways that parents would not do in order to get the kind of citizens that it wants rather than the kind of citizens that we would choose to be. And that's a major problem, and a number of the speakers are going to talk about the various ways that that is happening. But the point of my cryptic title about self-government squared is that there is also a very important sense in which a free system of government depends on the family, because only people capable of governing themselves in a personal sense, only people possessed of self-control, including the kind of self-control that let the Allies withstand a series of stunning setbacks early in the Second World War, and nevertheless, and against the odds, prevail in the end. But it takes this kind of firmness of character to uphold limited government instead of using the state as either a piggy bank or a security blanket. And my argument here is that at the root of good character is a stable, functioning family. That this is where people learn fair play, self-control, and the kind of self-respect that also respects the rights of others. And of course, I need to be clear that there are exceptions. There are some people raise their children very well in very difficult circumstances, and other people who have stable families raise their children very badly. There's no question that life is a complex phenomenon, and I mean no disrespect to the single parents who manage to do the job, and I do offer something of a reproach to the intact parents who do not manage to do the job. There are all kinds of pitfalls, and I know that parenting is difficult. I'm a parent, and I shall judge not lest I be judged. But at the same time, I want to insist that as a general rule, you are a lot better off in the kind of citizens that you are surrounded by if the family is intact. And I've been thinking about this for a great many years, and as is my wont, I've been collecting conclusions, quotations on this, and so I put them all together in my file, and my speech was 54 pages long, but if you're going to praise self-control in front of an audience, you must exhibit at least a modicum of it, and therefore I trimmed it down somewhat. However, nobody's perfect, so the first one is me. Quoting myself is not exactly exemplifying all the virtues, but it struck me at a Liberty Fund conference where people were talking about all sorts of abstractions to do with liberty, and some of them from quite a libertarian point of view, and I have a great deal of respect for libertarianism, but it does have its limits. It was this: people should govern themselves but not others. And this was later stolen by George W. Bush, though he may not have known I'd said it. In his second inaugural, he said, "Self-government relies in essence on the government of the self." So it's a good line, and it sounds good. But what does it mean? And honestly, did George Bush and the Bush Republicans actually walk the talk? This is a president who never once vetoed a spending bill because it was too large. This is a man who made no effort to control the tendency of the American government to borrow until it ruined itself and the nation in order to continue handing out money to the electorate. So, as Kenny Stabler of the Oakland Raiders used to say, easy to call, hard to run. And some people take this, I think, a little too far. Samuel Smiles, who wrote this irritatingly chirpy self-help book in the 19th century, said it may be of comparatively little consequence how a man is governed from without, whilst everything depends upon how he governs himself from within. But that, of course, is not true. It mattered a great deal that we were not conquered by Adolf Hitler. Being ruled by Adolf Hitler from without is a really serious problem in terms of how you conduct your life, even if you have the self-control of a Roman Stoic. So I have a line here from John Adams, who I much prefer to his rival Thomas Jefferson. Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. And I don't know that there's a lot of disagreement with that idea in this room, but I'm going to continue to emphasize it for a while here because it's what all my slides say, so I really have to. But also because I think it is an idea that is critical to the links we're going to try and forge in the course of this conference, and I think it is an idea that by and large has been lost in the modern world. It is not the way in which people typically talk today. It is not the way in which politicians typically talk today, and it is not language that voters might respond to all that well. And if that's the case, obviously the task before us is as hard as it looks, but that's okay. We have gathered here year after year well aware that we were facing appalling odds in our struggle to preserve the system of self-government under which human dignity can flourish, and we just, I hope, have all said, well, it has pleased God to give us a task well worth doing, and then go home and scratch our heads at why he picked us in particular. But, you know, I've always thought that one of God's less appreciated qualities is a sense of humor. Nevertheless, apparently he has done so, and therefore here we are, and we are going to proceed in the spirit of the great G.K. Chesterton, who took a profoundly serious view of all matters and yet was a font of jollity such as the world has rarely seen. And of course, I cannot get through any talk without quoting him. And he said, "A boy plays at being a soldier or at being a brigand, but have you ever known a boy who played at being a lawyer? A child does not want self-government. A child wants to have a good time. And it is our business, who know how short but how creative is his time in Eden, to give him a good time. But you cannot have a good time if you have self-government. Personal self-government is a most horrible nuisance. Public self-government is worse." And this, of course, is true. I mean, if self-control were easy, life would be very, very different. This would be sort of pre-fall, and that's not where we are. We are instead in this world where temptations continually beset us to do all sorts of things that in our hearts we know we should not do. And if we're going to sustain self-government, we must be able to resist those temptations at least half the time. You know, well, sure, we'd like to get to 100%, but you know that doesn't happen very often. If you dig out your old schoolwork and ask how often did I get 100% on a test, well, tricky. And then I had this quotation from Joseph Schumpeter about how electorates and parliaments must be on an intellectual and moral level high enough to be proof against the offerings of the crook and the crank, or else men who are neither will be driven into the ways of both, which I think is a very good warning, including about the way politics is going, but it's a little dry. So I also have from America the Beautiful, "God, mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law." So you see that this idea, at a time when government really was more limited, though not without its failings, people knew about this, and they thought about it, and they talked about it. It was quite clear to them that classic line, freedom isn't free. They knew that this was true. Thomas Paine, and I'm not a big fan of Thomas Paine, he was kind of a maniac, but he did say some good things, including, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it." And again, today you'd have to say, "must like adults." If you said like men, your public career would be over. But there is chiseled on the American-Korean War Memorial on the National Wall in Washington, "Freedom is never free." But it's not just a matter of standing up for ourselves. All kinds of horrifying barbarian tribes have done that sort of thing. The Mongols were no shirkers when it came to asserting their rights as they understood those rights to be. It's this business about standing up against ourselves that makes life so tricky. And some people have actually concluded that it's impossible. For some reason, in the mid-20th century, Walter Lippmann was a very popular American public philosopher, sort of a liberal, though not conspicuously insane, which was more common in those days. But he once said, "The public philosophy cannot be popular, for it aims to resist and to regulate those very desires and opinions which are most popular." And there are conservatives who thought the same way. People like Leo Strauss who thought the masses really will never govern themselves, and so a wise elite must somehow trick them into sustaining limited government. And to my way of thinking, this is a perilous path to tread, both in practice and in theory, because it certainly embodies the sin of pride. And when you're talking about things that you don't really feel like resisting on a daily basis, boy, pride is one, isn't it? One of Chesterton once said, if he could only preach one sermon, it would be against the sin of pride, because all the other deadly sins attack us where we are weak, but pride attacks us where we are strong. And it's therefore, I think, one of the most dangerous things, especially to people like me who like to get up in public and tell you all what you should think. Luckily, you won't believe everything I say, so it's self-correcting in that regard. Please don't throw anything, I get it. But I also want to present you a more optimistic view or a more hopeful view from a more credible source than myself, that is George Washington. He said, "In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened." So he thought it could be done. He thought you really could have a populace that took an intelligent, balanced, and disciplined view of public affairs. By the way, Chesterton's version on this one was, "When a man says that democracy is false because most people are stupid, there are several courses which the philosopher may pursue. The most obvious is to hit him smartly and with precision on the exact tip of the nose." Aristotle, restraining the impulse to clout anybody, said, "A state's being sound requires the citizens who share in the Constitution to be sound." And again, that is a sentiment that, while challenging, is also encouraging, because he clearly thought you could have sound citizens, that you could have an electorate that had the kind of qualities necessary to sustain over time a government that protected our legitimate rights, that defended us against force and fraud, but that was not an agency for encouraging our tendency towards sloth or petulance. Though governments easily can slide into that. The great paradox of all government is summed up by Juvenal's question about who's going to guard the guardians. And funnily enough, Juvenal was talking about these people in ancient Rome who were going around criticizing people for loose living. He wasn't really talking about government. There were these self-appointed guardians of morality, and Juvenal asked, well, who's going to keep an eye on these guys? And again, that's a very good question, right? It's easy to campaign against sin in other people. The hard part is when you have to do it against yourself. And when you say, well, the problem with government is to get it to control itself, and then you say, we'll do that through democracy, you've just transferred the problem. Now the question is, how is the electorate that is charged with controlling the government going to control itself? How will it not sink into all kinds of dangerous behavior, one of which is certainly voting yourself the contents of the treasury, another of which is becoming really mean-spirited? And if you look at politics today, you can see there is an enormous amount of partisanship that is vitriolic. And it's easy to do that because the people we're up against are clearly mean-spirited fools. But, quote that great philosopher Danny Hozack, when you're arguing with a fool, make sure he isn't too. Great piece of wisdom, which I occasionally do try to cherish. And another thing that Aristotle said here is that freedom to do exactly what one likes cannot do anything to keep in check that element of badness which exists in each and all of us. So from the very beginning of these deliberations about self-government, it was clear that a certain kind of libertarianism was unsuitable. As Washington, in his first annual address to Congress, said, it was essential to discriminate the spirit of liberty from that of licentiousness. And one of the problems with a certain kind of libertarianism is that they assume that if you make rules that say nobody can use the state to rob one another, nobody will go around and change those rules. But the great problem of constitutions is that if the people can make a constitution, the people can alter a constitution, and if the people can make a wise constitution, they can alter it in foolish ways. Or they can conduct themselves in the voting booth and elsewhere in such a way that what the Constitution actually says doesn't matter anymore. As Lord Acton said, great friend of liberty in the Victorian era, liberty is not the power of doing what we like, but the right of being able to do what we ought. And that, again, there are so many hazards here. For instance, because Lenin had that kind of view taken to an unpleasant extreme, that the government made you free to do what Lenin told you to do, because that was what you should do, so that was true freedom. Now, that won't do. But what Acton meant is that we have to be people who, given the option of voting ourselves the contents of the Treasury, deliberately don't do it. I remember this back when George Bush Sr. was running for president. Some guy with a ponytail stood up at some public event and said, "We are all your children. What are you going to do for us?" And Bush made some typically obsequious answer. And I was thinking what he really should have said was, "Look, you're not my kid. If you were, I would have raised you better. I suggest you cut your hair and get a job. The government's not here to meet your needs. You know, tell me a sad tale and move along." And by the Calvin Coolidge really did do that. Again, I've probably told this story before about a delegation of farmers coming to see him and telling him all the usual stories that farmers have about how times are tough and the prices are low and the locusts have come and the weather is awful and the railroads are against them and so on and so on. And when they had laid out this litany of complaints, Coolidge said, "Better get religion." And being Coolidge, he said no more, and eventually they had to leave. But you're never going to have politicians like that unless you're willing to elect them and re-elect them. And yes, Calvin Coolidge did in fact win a landslide as presidential candidate. And I should mention that Coolidge also commented to a friend around that time. He said, "It seems that the American people want a solemn ass as president, and I'm willing to go along with them." But it is a very serious business. As Chesterton said, the opposite of funny isn't serious, it's not funny. So Edmund Burke, the great English Whig at the time of the French Revolution, said, "Somewhere there must be a control upon will and appetite, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without." And so people who cannot control themselves will be controlled by their government, not just because governments have this appetite for more and more power and are filled with sanctimonious people who think they know better than you, but because a people who will not govern themselves must be subject to control, or you really will get anarchy of a disastrous sort. In fact, there's more to that quotation that starts, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites, in proportion as their love of justice is above their rapacity, in proportion as their soundness and sobriety of understanding is above their vanity and presumption, in proportion as they are more disposed to listen to the counsels of the wise and good in preference to the flattery of knaves." Now imagine, I mean, even Burke, right, he was in Parliament and he told the electors that he was going to govern them in this manner, and they said, "We'll take someone else, thank you very much." So even back then, this was a perilous thing to do. But wouldn't you just love to hear some politician deliver those remarks today? To stand up and tell the voters, or people say, "Well, we want more handouts," to tell them, "No, you shouldn't get them, you're not going to get them, or at least if you are, you're not going to get them from me." By the way, Burke also said that men of intemperate minds cannot be free, their passions forge their fetters. And again, I would like to hear somebody talk like Burke or even Lincoln today. Their passions forge their fetters. That's poetry in motion, isn't it, right? Imagine, I mean, even the politicians you like, never mind the ones you despise, somehow accidentally getting off a line that good. It's one of the extraordinary things about modern politicians that it is so hard to remember anything they ever said. And if you do remember, say, something that Justin Trudeau once said, it's not going to be one of those times he hit the nail on the head, is it? It's going to be one of those times he couldn't explain what bottled water was. By the way, another line from Calvin Coolidge. "The people cannot look to legislation generally for success. Industry, thrift, character are not conferred by act or resolve. Government cannot relieve from toil. It can provide no substitute for the rewards of service. It can, of course, care for the defective and recognize distinguished merit. The normal must care for themselves. Self-government means self-support. Assuming, of course, that what is normal is people who can care for themselves. And, by the way, there's a line, I don't know if any of you read Cormac McCarthy's books. Apparently Cormac McCarthy's meant to be encouraging. I mean, he's a very good writer, and I think that he is on the side of good, but oh, are his books depressing. But in No Country for Old Men, Sheriff Tom Bell says, "It takes very little to govern good people, very little, and bad people can't be governed at all. Or if they could, I never heard of it." Or as Joseph de Maistre put it, every country gets the government it deserves. And that's really spooky. People say, oh, our politicians are so terrible, look at Trudeau, look at this, look at that. But if de Maistre is right, Trudeau is not the cause of our troubles, he is merely a symptom of them. And so all of this just reinforces this message. Again, G.K. Chesterton, thank you very much, assuming that, there we are. Self-denial is the test and definition of self-government, and that is true in both cases, right? That is true when you're talking about yourself personally. I remember I was hearing this story about somebody whose life was obviously a complete mess, who had won $1,000 in a casino and spent $750 of it on a taxi ride home. And I feel sorry for this person, because it was obvious that they complete incapacity to see that if they took the bus, they'd have $1,000 tomorrow, and if they took the taxi, they'd have no money at all. This is a person who deserves sympathy, but is also not the person I want to see in the ballot box booth next to me, because you just know what they're going to do. And in fact, I've been hinting at this. You know, there's this famous quotation that democracy is an evanescent form of government which lasts only until its constituents discover that their vote is the key to the treasury. It's often attributed to Cicero, though he didn't say it, but it is a real problem. That is what has happened to us. We are voting ourselves the contents of the treasury. No politician is willing to touch the social programs, even though it is the social programs that are driving the deficits and the deficits that are driving the debt. And in their hearts, they all know it. They may talk about waste, or in the United States, the military budget, but everybody knows where the money really goes, and nobody wants to talk about it because the voters don't want to talk about it. Whereas in the 19th century, another Whig, liberty exists in proportion to wholesome restraint. And again, try and get a politician today to use the word wholesome in a speech. Good heavens. But, you know, what if it's true anyway? And I say politicians won't talk this way. Well, the world has changed dramatically. And one of the things I frequently say at these conferences is, remember, if the other side can win in a hurry, so can we. And this is a quotation from the American vice presidential candidate back in 2000, right? Not in 1847, not in 1312 or something like that. Oh, sorry, that's John Adams. What's he doing here? Oh no, that's right. It's a twofer, because Joe Lieberman was quoting John Adams approvingly. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Can you imagine Joe Biden saying that? Or Kamala Harris? Or Donald Trump? I can't imagine Donald Trump saying that. And if he did, we'd all be obliged to say, then what are you doing here? I'm sorry. I know a lot of you like Donald Trump, but I'm here to tell you the truth, not what, as I see it, not to pander to you, and I don't. You know, when the Americans were going from being essentially disarmed to being the greatest military power on the earth early in their part of World War II, Eisenhower looked at some of these recruits and he said, where do we get such men? And that is an excellent question, to which the answering part is you find them in church. But where do you get churchgoers? Well, to some extent, you get them because they're raised in proper families. They're raised to feel that the universe makes sense. Now, I know if you go to church, you're also going to find people whose lives were a complete mess until they found Christ or he found them, right? This is not iron law, and there are all kinds of people who find themselves in the most horrifying darkness and get back to the light. And then there are other people who wander into the darkness with remarkably little apparent excuse. But as a rule, If we are going to find such people, it is going to be because they were given an opportunity and help in becoming such people. It is because something in our society made them what they needed to be to sustain self-government. Now, as I said, all kinds of people manage to raise their kids in extraordinary adversity and do a very good job, and a lot of people who don't seem to have a lot of problems do a terrible job. You know, this famous thing about sometimes having a lot of money makes it hard to raise kids with self-discipline. But as a rule, intact families work better. And I want to quote Jordan Peterson here. That'll maybe get back in your good books after I diss Donald Trump. Jordan Peterson on safe spaces. Do you really want a safe place? Is that what you want? You want to be so weak that you want to be protected from threat? What the beep kind of life is that? You're a paralyzed rabbit in a hole. That's no life for a human being. You should be confronting danger and the unknown and malevolence. Why do so many young adults want a safe space? And I think part of the answer, and it's so sad to think about, because they've never known one. Because they didn't have solid boundaries. Another line that's very much stayed with me, and I forget who said it, that young people need adults. They need them to lean on when they're little, and they need them to push against when they're bigger. But so many children today are not being raised with adults they can lean on when they're little, or they can push against when they're big. The adults are rebelling, right? The adults are perpetual teenagers trying to smash authority structures from within. And again, I want to maintain balance by quoting Samuel Johnson. How small of all that human hearts endure, that part which laws or kings can cause or cure. So to some extent, it's true that the government can not do a whole lot for us, but it can do a lot to us if we have the wrong kind of government. And that is why we have to figure this out. And of course, there are a lot of people, like the theorists behind modern education, were very clear on what they were trying to do. They were trying to get the state to shape the character of the citizens instead of parents, because they wanted a different kind of citizen than the parents were going to give them. They wanted a citizen who was more malleable. They wanted a citizen who was more obedient. They wanted a citizen who had less character and less internal fortitude. And it's very hard to fight against this because of something Carl Jaspers said. The free societies are open societies. We question, we challenge, we talk back to authority. Job talked back to God, right? It's right there in the Old Testament. Hey, God, you messed up, right? And he is not struck by lightning for having said that. In fact, he got struck by lightning first and then said, excuse me, I didn't really like that very much. But Jasper said, in the West, it is the exceptions which break through the universal. And in this is rooted the perpetual disquiet of the West, its continual dissatisfaction, its inability to be content with any sort of fulfillment. And the challenge would be to defend the traditional family without denying room for people who live in other ways, without becoming this kind of parody that the woke have of the traditional family as an agent of oppression and uniformity, as opposed to being the place in which character and individuality flourishes. And so, and I have 1 minute left, you know, there's a saying that God will provide, and it's true in big and small ways. I was reading my latest copy of Gilbert, the magazine of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, on the airplane on the way out here, and I came across this, what? What's that doing there? From Chesterton, the ideal for which the family stands in the state is liberty. It stands for liberty for the very simple reason with which this rough analysis started. It is the only one of these institutions that is at once necessary and voluntary. It is the only check on the state that is bound to renew itself as eternally of the state and more naturally. The state consists of coercion and must always be justified from its own point of view in extending the bounds of coercion. The only thing that can be set up to check or challenge this authority is a voluntary law and a voluntary loyalty. That loyalty is the protection of liberty in the only sphere where liberty can fully dwell. There must be a heraldry and heredity of freedom, a tradition of resistance to tyranny. A man must be not only free, but free-born. And so the question is, are we still that kind of people, and can we continue to produce generation after generation of that kind of people? For just as we need to protect the family from the state, no, I don't. We're getting ahead on our schedule. Oh, you're right. I was thinking I had 40 minutes, and I was looking to 40 on the clock. Well, that's okay. What we're going to look at in this conference, as I said, is, first of all, and it's a very important thing, how to protect the family from the state. And, of course, I haven't said a word about COVID mandates here, because I haven't needed to. Right? You all were thinking, and we were denied medical choice, and we were forced to wear masks and all this stuff. And there are all these stories, either terrible or pathetic. Like last time I flew before I came out here, there was still a mask mandate on the plane. So, of course, I bought myself a cup of coffee, which for some reason I found myself drinking very slowly. And thus I got on the plane with my cup of coffee and no mask, and the flight attendant said, "You must wear a mask." And I said, "No, I'm drinking this cup of coffee." And she said, "But you have to wear a mask until you get to your seat." And I said, "So is your concern that if I walk down the aisle with no mask, I'm going to give them leprosy, but once I sit down, it's all cool?" And, she gave me the look of a overworked, headache-possessing flight attendant. So I put on the mask, walked down the aisle, and took it off. And that's the trivial side. But part of what's wrong as liberty slips away is that we cease to object to petty idiocy. We allow ourselves to be subjected to small things that we know are wrong, and that is habit forming. And of course, there were much larger things. And one of these was this general inability of parents to make medical choices within the confines of their family. It was not the choice of parents whether schools had mask mandates or not. It was not the choice of parents whether schools closed or not. And of course, one of the things that we obviously need, a critical bulwark against the presumption of the state, is school choice, which you have more of here in Alberta than we do in Ontario. But it was in 1955, which even to me now seems a long time ago, that Milton Friedman proposed the idea of school vouchers. Said, yes, the state should insist that every parent educate their children. The community is justified in using the police power of the government to prevent bad parents from not teaching their children basic things, right? That actually is child abuse, not to give your kid basic skills and knowledge and understanding. But, and John Stuart Mill actually got on it 100 years before Friedman did, the state should not deliver the education. The state should give every parent a voucher good for the average cost of the education, and that voucher can be given to any qualified institution. And again, you don't want the state being too rigorous about what's a qualifying institution, but you do need some standards. You can't have people just pocketing the money. You can't have people who say 2 + 2 is 5. But you want the money in education to follow the students to where the parents put them, instead of the students following the money to where the government put it. And it surely is remarkable that this proposal has not been widely adopted in the close to a century since Friedman proposed it. The reason it hasn't is that a lot of people don't want parents determining the education of their children. This is a very major example of the state interfering in parenting because it has a different agenda. And its agenda is partly driven by the starry-eyed social justice warriors who really think they can produce the new Soviet man. But it's also an instinct that the kind of kids that will be raised in state schools will be a lot easier to govern because they will be dependent upon the state. They will not be able to look after themselves. And I will go further and say one of the consequences of the breakdown of the family is that a very large number of your fellow citizens are, for all practical purposes, as adults, married to the state. They are employed by the state, or they are dependent upon state handouts. The number of people in our society whose income is derived at least 50% from the state is frighteningly large. And so, as I say, it is very important that we protect the family from the state, because the family's where we live. You think about, I think it might have been Tony Robbins talking about when you are on your deathbed, assuming that you are given time to sit and think instead of just being struck down suddenly, which is also a very real possibility in this world. How many people said, I'd wished I'd spent more time, ... right? And there's a lot of things you wouldn't fill in, like, I wish I'd spent more time watching television, or I wish I'd spent more time at the office, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. That was probably very high on the list. And people, even today, politicians, they talk about hard-working families. And the NDP is particularly prone to that. And I always want to ask them if they don't understand that child labor is outlawed, right? But the more they praise families, the less they support them. And so, again, it is really important to protect the family against the state and against those people who would meddle with your life and impose alien doctrines on your children that you yourself would never permit in your house. But it is also really important that we protect the family so that it can sustain the state in governing properly. The state, a proper government, a government that does the things a government should do and does not do the things a government should not do. A government that could rally its people to defeat the Kaiser or Napoleon or Philip II or Hitler or Xi Jinping needs intact families even if it doesn't know it. And so that is why we are going to give attention here to both of these problems. How to protect our personal autonomy from an overbearing government that thinks it knows best, but also how we are going to prevent the government from itself becoming corrupt, dissolute, and ineffective. And I would add, since apparently I'm still not out of time, though I guess I'm now getting close, one of the things that surely strikes you if you read the news today is that government at all levels in this country is incompetent. Shockingly, horrifyingly, can't tie its shoes, incompetent. It takes them 30 years to buy a ship. And you might think, well, they don't really want to buy warships. They're just faking it there. But if you've been following, and you probably have, the inquiry into the invocation of the Emergencies Act, one of the things that is stunning about this is that the authorities in Ottawa, from the Ottawa Police up through the provincial to you-know-who up there at the top, he who must not be named, were not engaged in some sinister and well-oiled conspiracy against the liberties of Canadians. They were complete addled fools, whose deliberations, when exposed in an inquiry, are embarrassing. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They were paying consultants to tell them it was some plot to inculcate hardline fundamentalist Christianity in the populace. And they got this and said that was money well spent. And then they had weapons, they had tire irons. It's not even good for government to have itself dissolve in this manner. And heaven help us if we had to fight a war. Again, Colonel Redman was filling us in on how little military we really have in this country. And so we started World War I with no military, and we started World War II with no military, but things move faster today. So the government is in fact incapable of sustaining itself, or the federal government with this Phoenix pay system. They can't even pay their citizens. Why? Because the government is full of people who are not self-controlled. The bureaucracy, the politicians, the electorate. Everybody suffers terribly when we do not have the kind of people that Churchill rightly thought we were back in 1939, 1940, and 1941. As he himself, about being the British lion, it was the nation that had the lion's heart, he said. And I think we still do, and I think we can still do it. But the time is short, and the task is hard, so I'm very glad that you're here, because we need to think about this, we need to resolve to do something about it, and then we need to go and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You're right on time. We're going to take a break at, you said you would be. You have been for 10 years, and we're happy with that. So we'll take a 20-minute break, and we'll start again at, David, I think, are you going to start, 15-minute break. So the timer will be on the screen, so let's everybody take a break. When we come back, we'll have Mattea Merta will be presenting from, I think she's in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, if I'm not mistaken, but she'll tell us when she gets here in a few minutes. So if you want to take a break, Michael Wagner is selling his books. Jeff Willerton's there selling some books. Michael Wagner has a whole host of books. He's also selling some of Andrew Lawton's Trucker Convoy books. You can pay cash for You can pay cash for Andrew's books, or you can have your bank account seized after dinner if you'd like to use your credit card. But I said, Kath McKenna, what did she lose? She lost $100 billion and they can't find it, but they can find $20 from a trucker. So maybe that's something we can talk about later in the day too. So thanks for being here. Let's take a quick break and we'll be back in 15 minutes, right? Thank you very much. From Mattea. She said, Danny, my power just shut off. Hopefully it'll be back on soon. I've since talked to her and she's driving to her office where the power is on. So she's going to be about 5 minutes or 10 minutes to get to the office. But anyway, if everybody wants to make their ways to the chairs, John was talking about fools electing fools. I think when Obama got elected, since we're picking on each other's presidential friends, you know what I mean? When Obama got elected, some fellow from the Czech Republic said America's problem isn't that they elected a fool for a president. Their problem is that they had enough fools to elect a fool. And quite frankly, I think most of the people in the room here would think that that would be Canada's problem too. It's not that we have a fool for a prime minister, it's that we have enough fools to elect a fool for a prime minister. But having said that, John, did you want to make a few comments? I think you gave up 5 or 10 minutes of time so we could be ready to select. The one thing that we are going to do on our hour of 11, Colonel Redman's going to come up at 10 to 11 so he can say some opening remarks before we get to the actual hour of 11. And then Colonel Redman's going to do the hour of 11 ceremony, and then our dear friend Bob Smith is going to lead us in a 5-minute prayer, like just after that, and then we'll get back to why the soldier fights with Colonel Redman. Go ahead, John.
I thought I might take advantage of this captive audience to tell a few Calvin Coolidge stories, because I do think that one of the most important things about carrying on a struggle against prevailing ideas is not to seem ill-humored. We want to be having a good time. We want to look like we're the fun ones, and that means we have to be the fun ones. So some of you may know the Coolidges actually had quite a menagerie. They had a lot of different pets, including they had, one year, somebody sent them a raccoon for their Thanksgiving dinner. And that is not the punchline, that is the setup to my story, because the Coolidges instead adopted the raccoon, and Rebecca the raccoon became a fixture in the Coolidge household. There was also a time when Coolidge had some visitors over, and they were all served tea, and then he took his tea and he poured it into the saucer to cool it off, which is what people actually used to do. This is a habit, obviously died out long ago now. But and then he looked around at his audience, and they, since he's the president, kind of all poured their tea into their saucers, and then Coolidge put his on the floor for the cat. But Coolidge would also do things. At one point when he was governor of Massachusetts, representatives of a particular local ethnic community were pestering him to appoint one of their own as a judge, and Coolidge wasn't prone to giving in to pestering. And finally, they hired a super high-powered lobbyist to go and see the governor. And when the lobbyist came in, Coolidge, instead of looking at them, was looking down at the carpet. There's this nice new carpet on the floor. And so, of course, the lobbyist looks at the carpet, and Coolidge says, "That's a nice carpet, don't you think?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Governor, it's a lovely carpet." And Coolidge said, "Costs a lot of money." And they, "Oh, well, it was well worth it. That's such a nice carpet." And Coolidge said, "They wore out the old one trying to get that judge." And that was all that he said. I mean, Coolidge really did conduct himself this way. And when he left the governorship, he told his successor, 9 out of 10 people who come into this office want something they shouldn't get. And if you just remain absolutely silent, say nothing whatsoever, after 3 or 4 minutes, they will run out of words and they will leave. And he really genuinely did this to people. And, again, this problem of who's in power, and again, we get these comments periodically, on our social media, we get all sorts of comments from the deeply thoughtful to the perhaps you shouldn't have had 3 drinks before approaching your computer kind of variety. But some of them, all we got to do is get rid of Trudeau. And it's like, do you really look at the run of prime ministers that we've had recently and think, the problem is that somehow we accidentally gave Trudeau 3 consecutive ministries? It's not that. I mean, I get these press releases from the NDP, the Liberals are the worst, they're propping up the oil companies, they don't care about workers, they don't care about climate change. And I'm thinking, and how many people vote for the NDP when it's propping up the Liberals while saying they're the worst thing ever? The problem is to get voters to think about the problem differently. And another of these American president stories, and this one is curious in a way because it concerns a Democrat. This is Grover Cleveland, so again, this is way back when. And I'm not unaware that American politics in days of yore had some very serious problems, especially when it came to race. But there was a drought in Texas, and there was a lot of pressure on Congress to vote relief for the Texas farmers. But back then, the general understanding was that the Constitution did not permit the government to just take money out of the Treasury and give it to somebody because they thought it would be nice if they had it. And so in the face of this pressure, Grover Cleveland said to the newspapers, if you're so concerned about the farmers, instead of bugging us, why don't you appeal to your readers to donate money to help these poor people? And the upshot of this was that the newspapers raised 10 times as much money from their subscribers as they'd been asking the government to give. And so I think it's also important that we have this very constructive vision that says that we can do this stuff, that we are a people who can deal with adversity with good humor and tenacity, whether that adversity is the war, or it is the need to care for the unfortunate among us, or it is the need to organize ourselves in order to deliver education better. And one thing we were just chatting in the break about the fact that one of the consequences of the lockdown that I think has gone largely unperceived is that people are in a foul mood. A lot of people, their nerves are raw, and I don't mean just people on one side or just people on the other side or even people who don't care about public policy. So everybody's in this terrible mood. And I think one of the things that's a good idea is not to be in a terrible mood. We have a rule on our social media that you can't use swear words. You can't even use acronyms. And I have people who go into fits over this. There's one person that I banned because I said, you can't use these acronyms, please post your comment without them. And he was like, oh yeah, well sure, we'll see about that, man. And so, I had to delete his comments, and then he posts more and says, oh, you're censoring me. Delete. Oh, you're a coward. Delete. I'm going to ruin you on other social platforms. Delete. Oh, I bet you're going to delete this too. Delete. And I'm thinking to myself, he's posted about 50 comments by now, and it's, really? This is all you've got to do? Like, you think you have this great understanding of the world and this is how you spend your time? Surely you could be out there inspiring someone to make change. And so I think we should all have this good supply of Calvin Coolidge stories. I mean, I'd love to have a good supply of Louis Saint Laurent stories, but there aren't really any great Louis Saint Laurent stories, and the funny stories about William Lyon Mackenzie King aren't really ones that make you wish you could have this person back in office. And Sir John A. Macdonald, unfortunately, they largely involve the consumption of adult beverages to excess, although, one thing, Macdonald periodically would, I think the pressure of work and so on just got to be too much for him, and he'd go off on a little bender. And at one point, some aide was looking for him because there was important things that had to be signed, and he found Macdonald curled up with one of these penny dreadful paperbacks that he would read while he was taking a break. And I guess it must have been a Western, because the guy came in and said, Mr. Prime Minister, you've got to get on your feet and come into the office and sign things. And Macdonald responded, "Vamoose from this ranch." I thought that must have been a line he'd just come across in the book and thought. So again, but I wish that we even had more good humor in our political debates. There have been some great American heckles. There was some pompous orator, and it might even have been Webster in the Senate saying, "I would far rather be right than president." And a voice from the back said, "Don't worry, you'll never be either." And I know I've probably shared this one before, it's my all-time favorite political insult is from Benjamin Disraeli, when his rival Lord John Russell became Prime Minister under Victoria. And Disraeli said that if a traveller were informed that this man were leader of the House of Commons, he might begin to understand how the Egyptians had worshipped an insect. So next time you're inclined to post one of those acronyms or something worse online, look up great political insults of the past. Disraeli also described Robert Peel's smile as resembling the silver fittings on a coffin. So I think that one of the things that we really want to do, other than making sure that our power is on or that we possess a generator, so that I don't have to get too far into my failed career as a stand-up comedian working only with political material, is to make sure that I think I've seen it attributed to Martin Luther, which is not a happy source, also to the founder of the Salvation Army, who asked, why should the devil have all the good tunes? And I think that is an excellent question. Why should the devil have all the good tunes? Just because we're on the side of the right doesn't mean that we shouldn't be the fun people as well. And that, of course, is especially important if you're being stereotyped as angry. Right? It's one of those, again, one of my rules, and I should do a graphic about this, that if they think you're a clown, don't show up in a fright wig. It is a very dangerous thing to play to people's stereotypes about you. For instance, the Prime Minister not observing Remembrance Day. I don't know who is advising him on public relations, but he clearly needs to get somebody else. If it was Jerry Butts, he should fire Jerry Butts, and if it wasn't Jerry Butts, he should bring Jerry Butts back. Because this is an extraordinary example of just making it too easy for the other side. But we also have to watch out for that, and that's why we need to stock up on these humorous political anecdotes to deploy. There's another one. I think I've got the attribution wrong. I always think this was Truman on Franklin Pierce, but at any event, somebody said of Franklin Pierce that he was a complete nincompoop, that he had no idea what was going on, and if he had known, he would have had no idea what to do about it. And I think that it is really important that we should be conducting this debate, because we are climbing such a steep hill, that we want to do it with a smile on our face. And there is so much joy in the world, and I think it's important. Again, this is true about being a light to the world from the opening prayer, right? That you want to be a light to the world. They don't mean a Klieg light, right? You don't want to be one of those harsh and unlovely glares that might be turned in someone's face to interrogate them. That we are going to fight the good fight in so many ways, and we will, achieve some victories and some defeats along the way. But we very much, I think, want to be happy warriors. And there's another Calvin Coolidge story that that often springs to my mind, where he had gone to church one day when his wife was ill and couldn't go. And when he came back, Grace asked him what the minister talked about, and Coolidge, being famously a man of few words, responded, "Sin." And after a pause, his wife said to him, "And what did he say about it?" And Coolidge replied, "He was against it." But it is true, because again, Chesterton talks about the fact that, there are a lot of very frivolous people in the world who don't say funny or flippant things. They just treat serious things in trivial manners. And I think, how many times have I heard someone give a speech on some public event, often without a single joke in it, or if there was a joke, it would have been best if they hadn't even made the attempt. But when it comes right down to it, it's what did he talk about? Poverty. What did he say? He was against it. That there is so little leaven in it of a real fundamental sort. It's one of the reasons I think what politicians say is so hard to remember. And if you've been down to the Washington Mall and to the Lincoln Memorial, one of the things they have is Lincoln's second inaugural. And I'm not going to succeed in quoting it verbatim, but he talks about how desperate everybody is for the war to end. But then he says, if the war should continue until every drop of blood that has been drawn by the lash is matched by one drawn by the sword, still we must say the judgments of the Lord are just and righteous altogether. And this is the way they would talk on a serious occasion, with language that really echoes, that is remarkable for the power of expression, because it's remarkable for the power of thought behind it. And this is something that I really think we can do, because one of the things that makes me cheerful is that I'm sure we are right. We're not right about everything. Well, I am, but we're gonna get some things wrong. We're gonna get some ideas wrong. We're gonna say some things wrong. There's all kinds of ways in which we're gonna slip up. But way deep down, we're on the side of a truth that cannot be defeated in the end. Somehow or other, it is just in the nature of the universe. The universe is so constructed that truth is at its core, and truth and love turn out to be the same thing. And so we ought to have a good supply of funny stories. I must know more Coolidge stories. Because they really had an enormous menage. They even had 2 raccoons at one point, but the male raccoon wandered off. Rebecca stayed, and the other raccoon went away. But I think they even had a pygmy hippopotamus at one point. And it's funny because Coolidge, was it Dorothy Parker said he looked as though he'd been weaned on a pickle. So, when he died, she said, how could they tell? I have one more of these. The headline was Coolidge Breakfasts with Actors, President Nearly Laughs. And what happens is that he was introduced to Will Rogers. And someone said, well, Mr. President, this is Will Rogers, the famous humorist. Mr. Rogers, this is President Calvin Coolidge. And as they went to shake hands, Rogers said, sorry, I didn't quite catch the name.
That was John Robson. Thank you, John. That's a pretty good fill-in. I think Mattea, Can you hear us? Are you there, Mattea? Yes, hello, Mattea, how are you?
I'm great, sir. Thank you all for your patience.
Oh.
That U.S. power grid got to me today.
Thank you very much. You got the power on, you're ready to go.
All good to
We have to be done by about 10:50, so, but if you get to 10:50 and you still have a little bit more to say, we do have a Q&A from 11:35 to 11:55. We would let you comment there, and hopefully, I don't know if you've got time to stay around for the question and answer, but ladies and gentlemen, I guess this is one of the glitches of, we couldn't have possibly gotten you here if we couldn't do it remotely, so a little bit of a 10-minute wait is fine by us. The first time I met Mattea was about 4 years ago. I thought she was going to high school, but it turned out she'd been working at the UN for 5 years. So anyway, welcome. She was traveling and helping Derek Sloan, but and now she's here, and Mattea, we're looking forward to hearing from you. So it's your turn to speak. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Danny, and to everyone joining this conference. I previously worked on Parliament Hill, so Danny, I have to correct you there, because I know the people that attend this conference, I did not work for the United Nations. I worked inside the UN, and still work inside the UN to fight the UN. Okay. So I'm just going to make that quick clarification, because I don't want a bunch of angry emails and phone calls right after this presentation. But nonetheless, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk with you all today. In the words of Hungary's great Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, family policy is indeed at the heart of all politics, and this is why I was really excited when Danny actually gave me that phone call and told me about the theme of this year's conference. Now, when we focus on the foundation of every society, we find the family. And this is the biggest passion of mine, even outside of, more so than government or politics, strategy, all those kind of good things. But we've never seen at a point in time the family so dismissed within societies globally as it is today. Nor have we seen it so demonized, or even young people in my generation, I'm 26, so we've never seen young people so discouraged to get married and to start a family. And the attack on the family unit is not only intentional, but it is fundamental to achieving agendas such as the United Nations Agenda 2030, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and as well as the globalist utopia found within the pages of the World Economic Forum. I'm sure you've heard of them too. The great saying of "you will own nothing and be happy," very anti-family, and this is why I'm a part of that fight on the globalist front to make sure that they are not successful. Now, time and time again, regardless of where families are, it is a proven fact. Data, research, we've had thousands upon thousands of years of families living that we can prove that strong families produce strong communities, which in turn produce strong nations. And this has been my consistent message throughout the years, which really started when I started working on Parliament Hill. And I started recognizing all these different policies and the impacts that policies had on both the fiscal and the social aspects of Canadians' lives. And whilst I was on the Hill, I had the opportunity to attend the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in New York City. It's the largest feminist conference in the world, and my being very not feminist, I was like, I want to be right in the center of that and figure out what their agenda is going forward. So at that commission, I encountered the root of a lot of the anti-family agendas that I was seeing both at home and abroad. And it's there that I recognize similar talking points being discussed that Justin Trudeau's government was actually pushing back in Canada. And one prime example of this is that of Trudeau's government's feminist foreign policy agenda. It was the first that Canada and even the world had actually ever witnessed. And many Canadians to this day are still not aware that feminism is actually the lens through which Trudeau's government determines foreign funding, aid, and really any kind of foreign policy considerations or decisions. And my being, I believe it was 2-3 years ago now, it's 2023, 24, when this announcement was made by Trudeau, I was appalled. And actually, but I wasn't surprised, to be honest. You just look at Trudeau and he was self-proclaiming feminist. It was bound to happen. But because, I wasn't surprised about this because this was the direction the United Nations had been pointing its member states in for quite a while. And when I say member states, that simply means the countries that are present at the table at the United Nations. Now, because of how my brothers and I were raised, my parents, I have the best parents in the world. You have parents, but my parents are the best. But they taught us growing up to pay special attention to patterns. And due to the way that I'm personally geared, I have always paid special attention towards patterns which produce human suffering, and I've always sought to find solutions to that suffering. Thus, I became kind of a policy wonk. And the continual issue that I've always come back to with regards to the suffering I was witnessing, whether it was in an individual's life or in the totality of society, it always came back to broken homes and homes in general. And in all my research, I have found conclusive evidence that the family structure is the one greatest predictor of whether a child will be aggressive, violent, obese, how well they'll also do in school. And that list is extensive. But I also found that married men and women tend to live longer, healthier lives. They have lower chances of becoming depressed, which is a huge issue within society today. But they also have fewer heart attacks. And again, that list could also go on and on. And yet we see the family structure and the benefits of the family structure continually under attack. And again, this is nothing to say of the societal benefits of marriage and family. And I often would question myself from, I would say, the age of 20 and older, why aren't governments promoting the family? And why aren't governments promoting marriage and having children? Because all I see are benefits and even solutions to societal problems. So why isn't, again, the family being looked at and considered as a solution? And so with this presentation, I wanted to bring up three different realms really, where we needed to focus in on. And the first one is the Judeo-Christian worldview on family. And, there's this huge separation within Western civilization right now from our Judeo-Christian roots, which is just producing a ton of chaos and disorder, to be honest. And I think everybody in this room, at least almost everybody in this room, would attest to that. We're seeing a lot of the ramifications of this separation. And if this one factor of that separation is successful, we will see our societies crumble. And some people go, well, how? And how can that be? And it's actually quite simple, because the foundation of our societies was founded upon fundamental truths, absolute truths, of what is right and what is wrong, what is just and what is not. And even the fact that absolute truths do exist and that there's benefits to adhering to them. Some of those involve building a family, that it's a personal and societal good, that the roots which brought us, all of humanity really, the very concept of human rights, that human rights belong to every member of the family, preborn to the oldest among us. The roots which gave all of humanity a blueprint of how to do family really well, regardless of the day and age in which any family dwelt. So our Judeo-Christian roots, they did all that, but they also established governments and government systems in which honored the families and set up legal systems which protected the family. But in this separation, we've seen that due to a lack of understanding of our roots, which John very clearly, very well spoke about this right before me, if we don't understand our roots and the value there is in adhering to them and living them out on a day-to-day basis, there's going to be a decline in societies at large. The abuse of authority, the assault on the family, increased divorce rates and single motherhood, abortion rates, and even for me, one of the biggest things I tackle, especially at the United Nations, is the violation of children's innocence, especially when it comes to education, which we'll get to in a few moments here. But all of it is indeed due to a lack of understanding of who we are and the value that we possess as individuals created in the image of God, but also a lack of understanding of who we are as a nation. And I wanted to bring a few things forward with regards to what's happening in society, the next steps, the next agenda items that are coming up, both in society but also from the UN's perspective. But from the societal perspective, with regards to attacking the family and how that attack is tied to our Judeo-Christian worldview, it's the demeaning of marriage. And it's already happening. I think we can all see that within society, just even based upon the data points we see coming out. Marriage is a declining institution. But with regards to marriage particularly, the talking points within the culture at large are gearing up to push that marriage is actually an oppressive institution and one that shouldn't be engaged in. That may be shocking to some, but it's what I'm seeing both in the culture, but also some of the talking points, the little breadcrumbs that are falling from the UN table, from different policy discussions. People I'm dealing with, bureaucrats at the UN, they're gearing up to push that marriage is actually an oppressive institution in society, one that should be done away with. Which is actually kind of funny because the second agenda item that they're going to start pushing, possibly even before that one, is the need for polygamous relationships to be recognized by the state. And which is funny because they want to do away with marriage on one part, but then they also want to push that polygamous relationships are indeed needed to be recognized by the state. And this piggybacks off of the legalization of gay unions. And we won't get too much into that. We don't have the time today. But everything that we see in society, all these societal ills, we can't look at them as independent of themselves. They're all symptoms of a root. So when you see talk about the abortion issue or euthanasia or gay unions, they're not independent. They all come back to an attack of a worldview that set the foundation for our nation. Now, speaking of that, one of the most common talking points of our day is indeed attached to a movement that the United Nations has heavily endorsed. And we see it all throughout society, in our children's classrooms, to TV programming, it's literally everywhere, and that's the slogan of love is love. And though that may sound good on the surface to an unsuspecting crowd, the ramifications are indeed devastating. Because what happens when you apply love is love to a situation, and I'm going to say it, where it involves an adult and a child, is it really just love is love at that point? We have to ask ourselves these questions. And with regards to how we think about the family unit itself, the normalization of such ideas as love is love, as polygamy, gay unions, and so on, we have to ask ourselves who benefits from these talking points being normalized in our societies. Is it individuals? Is it children? Is it the government? Who benefits? Now, one of the major changes the United Nations wants to see in international law concerning the definition of family is moving away from where it currently stands. And the current definition of family under international law is, and I quote, the natural and fundamental group unit of society, which is great. It's the marriage between one man and one woman. That is a family in international law. But the UN wants to see that moved. They want to see it changed to this, a community-based arrangement. And as someone who has studied communism, who has read the Communist Manifesto, that was a big point of contention for me. I kind of freaked out at that one. Changing any kind of change in language is of great concern to me, but especially this one, because this is complete commie language. Because nations, the ramifications of changing that definition means that nations, Canada, United States, Brazil, and so on, they actively use the United Nations definitions and even policy recommendations to form national, state, local, all the way down to policies affecting our children in the classroom. And with regards to the changing the family definition, the most affected group of individuals will be that of our children at the end of the day. And God gives children to one mother and one father for a very specific reason. He doesn't give them to a group of people. He doesn't give them to a community. He doesn't give them to a government system. He gives them to parents. And this is for their safety, for their development, comprehensive development, their emotional, physical, spiritual well-being, flourishing of children, but also, most importantly, for the instilling of generational values into them. And the giving of children to parents also benefits parents themselves, because if we give children to a community, or if we say that children belong to a collective, I'm sure many of you here are parents, or want to be parents or grandparents. So if you have children in your life, you've probably had to grow in patience, probably grown a lot in self-control, and many other character traits. But that's something that would be stripped away from society, which again is an intentional attack on the family. And we're already seeing this notion of children belong to the community springing up mainstream, in mainstream culture. The establishment media, politicians use this all the time now. And though this may sound like a radical ideal, politicians will push forward radical things in order to normalize them in the psyche of the population. Let's take Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, AOC, as she is most well known as. Her Green New Deal, people saw that, they read it, they heard about it, and they flipped. They were like, this is whack, this is weird. And now we jump forward a couple years after she proposed that, and over those years, between then and now, the media has normalized a lot of the talking points and the policy positions within that piece of legislation. All the way to the point of now we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually took a bunch of policy points from the Green New Deal and inserted it into the Inflation Reduction Act. And everybody's cheering it on now. So politicians will push something completely radical, such as children belong to the community and not to parents, as I believe it was MSNBC's Melissa Harris Perry did in an interview. You can go look that up. It's fascinating to see. But they push this in order to normalize it, and that's what they're going to start doing with regards to seeing children as a collective. They don't belong to parents. They belong to the collective society. And one final issue I'll bring up on this specific point is that of abortion. I know it's a taboo subject and a lot of people don't like to delve into it. I spent majority of my career dealing with the issue of abortion. But again, you can't look at all these things as disjointed. They all come back to the same root, and that is to undermine the family. And when we see the statistics coming out that the majority of women across the globe are predominantly having abortions, either it's due to coercion or it's due to a lack of financial and material resources, which from a policy perspective, I went, it's an opportunity for politicians to be like, oh my gosh, hey, we can actually help build our nation up by helping support our families. But we see Justin Trudeau, for example, who is lock and step with in line with the United Nations, him actually demeaning places like pregnancy resource centers and saying that we'll protect so-called what the United Nations terms as sexual and reproductive health and rights, or SRHR. That's the language Trudeau has started to use as well when it comes to abortion. But what we can't just see abortion as anymore when Trudeau uses this lingo of SRHR. It's not just abortion when he talks about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I'm going to keep bringing that up because it's really important for us to understand. Because under that umbrella, there's abortion, yes, but there's sterilization. It includes comprehensive sexuality education, which we'll get into in a moment. But it's this attempt to thwart the rights of families, to drive down populations. And a lot of people in the United States freak out about the Great Replacement theory. It's not a theory, it's very real. And Justin Trudeau has his own Great Replacement theory happening up in Canada. Again, we don't have time to get into all of that today because it is an exhaustive topic to talk about. But let's move on to education, because we touched on comprehensive sexuality education. Now, when it comes to education, the attempts to solidify the state's roles as mothers and fathers is immense. And again, John talked about this previously. Great speech, by the way. But as I was doing some of my research to bring to people actually at the United Nations, I found these two lecturers from the University of College of Cork who co-wrote this paper arguing that very explicit forms of sexuality education is, and I quote, a primary right a human right of children. And it should be an independent of the state discretion and or parental rights that children receive explicit sex ed. Which I'll briefly tell you as parents and as grandparents and advocates, that the sex ed of my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation is nothing what children receive now in government schools. They don't call it sex ed anymore. They call it sexuality education for a very specific reason. Sex ed had to deal with biology. Sexuality education has to deal with gender theory. So biology is just it's like 10, maybe 20% of all that they're taught. And it's not sectioned off to one class anymore. It's in their math curriculum. It's in their history. It's in science class. It's spread throughout. And that's where they say that children need to receive an inclusive, all-encompassing education. That's what they mean. They mean that sexuality education, gender theory needs to be spread out through every single aspect of a child's academic career. Now, one of the major issues that we're dealing with at the UN right now with regards to education and children is so-called child rights. And that's pushed through sexuality education. And it's a stronghold for institutions like the United Nations, different organizations and philanthropists, and of course governments, because what we call comprehensive sexuality education, which I'm going to short to CSE from here on out, that targets the hearts and minds of the next generation, which in turn are future voters. And this type of curriculum, it intentionally seeks to drive a wedge between parents and their children by undermining the values and beliefs that are actually taught to children in the home. A couple years ago, actually, I reported, I think it was at the Post-Millennial, on the Human Rights Watch submission to the United Nations, what we call a special rapporteur, just it's a special word for expert, on privacy rights, which, if the Human Rights Watch submission actually went into full implementation, would mean for globalists that they could actually pressure nations to grant children legal rights to bypass parental consent, which we're seeing already happening in society. Now, these so-called rights given to children would mean that they would have absolute privacy when accessing abortions, hormone injections. The gentleman and his family from BC come to mind, if you haven't heard about them, but also puberty blockers, information online and offline at school on any subject. So access to pornography would be permitted, access to any kind of explicit information. So this would go all the way down, and there's so many examples. Males, biological males using female bathrooms, so on. But this would all be included in a child's right. Now, I won't go into everything that the UN is doing on that front, because again, exhaustive, but it goes directly against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I could point out several different articles within the UDHR that it goes against, but one in particular says that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. And that applies to when they're at home or in a secondary educational institution. Now, the UCC, these academics that I talked about previously, pointed out several times to the European Court. Now I see I'm running out of time here. I'm actually going to skip over what they said because it's just jargon and they are annoying as heck, and I don't want to annoy you with what they actually said. But at the end of the day, parents will always know what is best for their children. Bureaucrats, philanthropists, the UN, globalists alike, you raise your children, you know them best. And again, this folds right back into that collectivist thinking that children belong to everyone. They don't. You know your kids best, raise them to the best of your ability. And when it comes to the next agenda item with regards to the United Nations and education, specifically sexuality education, I wanted to make everybody aware that though you may send in, many parents want their children exempt from sex ed class. So though you may send in an exemption letter to your school for your children, that exemption letter doesn't necessarily apply to pre and post school care. And this is one of the ways that the UN is trying to ensure that your children are indoctrinated and undermining the values that you're teaching them in the home. So pre and post care, and before and after school care rather, they want to make sure that the programs being taught across the globe, not just in Africa, not just in Canada, across the globe, that children are being taught this explicit sex ed, regardless of where they are in the schools. Now, I could talk a lot about how feminism got infiltrated into the schools, but that's a whole other side to this thing. But we'll jump to the third point that I have, and that's sustainable development, which I'm sure everybody here has heard about some sort of sustainability, this, that, the other thing, and how sustainable development is tied into or is in relation to the family. And Agenda 2030, again, I believe several speakers here in past have talked about Agenda 2030, but we tend to hear a lot about the sustainable development. And family, on that front, with regards to it, I have both positive and a little bit of negative news. But on some of the negative side, the direct references to the family, a little bit of history for you, all the family references were stripped from the Sustainable Development Goals during negotiations. Funny thing is that in the actual Agenda 2030, though, that document actually refers back to several established UN documents which uphold the value of family. So you have to understand within the UN system, there's always contradiction and always chaos within its own system. And I think it's quite funny to watch because they haven't really been able to make any solid steps forward. But we have to understand, there's this saying, whatever happens in Europe is only 3 to 5 years away from happening in North America. Well, whatever happens at the New York UN campus, whatever is established in policy there or even proposed as a policy there, is only 2 to 3 years away from being enshrined in legislation in North America. And this is what we have to understand, especially when it comes to Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. I encourage everybody to go and look up the what we call the SDGs. And I wanted to give you a way, because I see I'm running out of time here, I wanted to show you a way how you should look at the SDGs. And it's through the lens of this is socialist and this is communistic. And even like what Trudeau did, feminist lens. You can even look at the SDGs through a feminist lens. And it's not about sustainability and the flourishing of families in the future. It's about limiting families. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we have an entire UN bureau that is solely conducting itself to limit the population of the world, UNFPA, which actually they had me kicked out of the, I believe it was UNFPA, a spokesperson from there, got me kicked out at the last feminist conference because I took a stand against their agenda, which is quite funny. But needless to say, let's look at how we look at an SDG. So I pulled up Goal 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's all about ensuring that there's inclusive and equitable education to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Now you have to look for trigger words, and I would say you look at inclusivity and something being equitable. Two big trigger words that point right back to social justice warriors, and we don't have time to delve into that, but you have to understand, just because something sounds great on the surface, just because the headline looks great, you have to look at the contents thereof to understand it. Now, I always take my cues from people who have been successful in this fight, and I entitled this Rebuilding the Family, because in order to rebuild anything, there has to be a foundation, a structure, a dismantlement, and then that rebuilding process. And I look at Hungary, the country of Hungary. Give me one moment to take a sip of water here. But I look at Hungary as an example of where governments, where we as populations, the voters should be looking to, excuse me, to understand what it is that we can do to clean up our societies, to ensure that families are secure and flourishing. Now, divorce rates are at an all-time low, marriages are up, abortions are low, and the rebuilding of family there started when they understood their adversary, communism, and when they chose to take a strong stand and not back down. And our stand today will indeed impact generations to come. So I encourage you, talk about marriage, talk about children, instill your values and convictions into your kids. The generational divide doesn't have to be as it is today. Bridge that gap, because you as parents, we as families, if the governments, we hold so much power that the governments attack us consistently. Understand your value and the power that you possess, because we know that so goes the family, so goes the nation. And I will turn it back right at my allotted time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mattea. I hope you can hear the applause. We're thrilled. We're absolutely thrilled. We're going to go right now to our hour of 11. Can you stay for the question and answer at, it'll be, I guess we'll be back to the question and answer at 11:30. I have 20 questions for you myself. As I was listening to you, I was wishing I had sent the link to your grandpa Jim. You should send them a link and tell them to click in and watch send them the link and tell them to watch the question and answer. We're just thrilled to have you here today with us, and so I'll just say goodbye for the moment, and we'll have our hour of 11 service, and then we'll talk to you again at 11:30, okay? But
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Colonel Redman, it's almost the hour of 11, so it's your turn. Mattea's grandpa Jim is a pilot in Lloydminster, and I'll tell you more about that after the hour of 11.
Hi, folks. I want to start the discussion by reminding myself and everyone that Remembrance Day isn't about veterans. I'm a veteran. Many of you in this room are veterans. It's about remembering our colleagues who didn't come home. I very proudly had these around my neck for 27 years. They're dog tags. Okay? Every soldier, sailor, airman, and woman wore them. And the reason why I consider these lucky is the bottom half is still attached. They are identical top and bottom except for the blood group, which is on the dog tags. And when one of your soldiers falls, you snap them in half, you jam the top half between their teeth and lock their jaw shut, so that later when someone comes across the body, they'll know who they were and they can be given a proper burial in accordance with their wishes. The bottom half is sent back through the lines so that loved ones can be told of their death in a proper and appropriate way. Every soldier, sailor, airman, and woman has them. And mine are lucky because they're still in one piece. But many of the people that went to war on our behalf, theirs aren't in one piece. They've been broken in half, and they were found later in many, many ways. I need to steal your clicker, or you can click for me. Is it? Okay. Right on. Thank you, sir. But I want to make sure that you understand at the start of our memorial service that every soldier, sailor, airman, and woman that I ever met, when they realized that they had joined a profession whose ultimate aim might be their death, the last thing they wanted people to do on Remembrance Day was to stand around and cry. The reason they fought was for our freedoms, and by freedom I mean that we could live, laugh, love, and find fulfillment. Not that we would stand around and cry. They wanted to make sure that the world was the world that they thought was worth protecting, and that was one where everyone and everything that they believed in terms of freedom still existed. And they were prepared to give their lives for it, and many of them did. Can you push the button for me?
The right side button.
Okay. All right, I'll go back. I will push. Yep, going to go back. And be patient. All right. All right. I've had my training. We all wear a poppy on Remembrance Day and for the 2 weeks leading up to it. And it's a poem that was written, and the bottom line is, it's not to be misused. It's to be used to remember them and why they died. It's not to be used as a symbol for a misconstrued concept. And the poppy's been taken, it's been made into different colors, it's been made with different centers, it's been made with a whole bunch of things, but it's really about taking the time to remember those who died to make sure that we have the country that we live in today. And if we're talking about Canadian veterans, and many people talk about all veterans, but I'm here to talk about Canadian veterans, we talk about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Merchant Marine, and the things they did for a very long period of time, war after war, to put us where we are today. I don't know how many of you, hands up those who've been lucky enough to go to the Vimy Memorial, to the Vimy Ridge Memorial. For those of you that haven't, I've been there several times. I took my young officers and my soldiers there when I was stationed in Germany 3 times. And you always should start at the bottom where the Canadians started and look at the trench systems and the reserve lines and everything that Sir Arthur Currie had built, so that we wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the French and the British who had tried to take that ridge before us. And his aim always was to minimize the number of soldiers who would die achieving an objective. As you go up, on the left-hand side, trench line after trench line, there are graveyards. And in those graveyards are all the people that they actually found with these stuck in their teeth. So there's a cross with a name, service number, and the date of death. But on that memorial, inscribed on that memorial, are all the names of the soldiers who didn't answer the roll call the next morning, who were never found. They cover the entire monument. Thousands and thousands of dead Canadians who were never recovered. All my great-uncles are inscribed on that cenotaph, and I'm very lucky to say that my grandfather on the Redman side didn't die, and he was 16 years old at the Battle of Vimy Ridge because he lied about his age. He came home with both pieces, and so had my father and so had me, but all of my great-uncles are there, making sure that we are here today. So I think it's important that we understand the significance not only of that memorial, but the poem that was written a year earlier by John McCrae, a Canadian. And if you would, if you feel free and happy enough to do it, I would ask you read In Flanders Fields with me before we get to our 2-minute silence. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely sing, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields, in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. From you, from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Think about the words, and think about what's happening in our country today, and the need for them to be able to rest. The defense of our freedom didn't stop with them in World War I, or World War II, or Korea, or in the service of peacekeeping operations or in other operations worldwide that Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women are in. They're with you and I in this room. We have to make sure we don't just honor their memory, but we remember what they died for: to laugh, to love, to have freedom, to find fulfillment, to raise families, and to be part of Canada. I don't want us ever to forget them. We did this through many, many operations, and it's still happening today. There are soldiers, sailors, airmen, and women from our country deployed worldwide, and they have been for many, many reasons and many, many opportunities, as our government might call it today. But I put it to you that they did it for families, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So with that, I would ask if you would personally reflect. People you know, people you never met. For the next 2 minutes, just think about those who gave their lives and those who were damaged beyond belief for our freedom. We will remember them. They grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. 2 minutes seems like forever. But imagine 2 minutes sitting in the bottom of a trench in World War I with rats and mud, and knowing that there's another 3 years to 20 years of war ahead of you. I always think of my grandfather. 4 years he fought. He ran away at 14 and served the entire war in the trenches in the First World War. Imagine how he felt for 2 minutes with the snow falling, the water rising in the trench, the shells coming down, and never knowing when the war would end. I want to thank you all for taking the 2 minutes with me and for thinking about those who've done so much for us. Danny?
Thank you, Colonel. Now we have Bob Mills is going to lead us in a short prayer, and then we'll get back to why we fight. Come on, Bob, it's your turn.
Not that I wouldn't be honored to be called Bob Mills, but a very good friend. At the conclusion of our time of prayer, we're going to join together in the Lord's Prayer. So it's going to be on the, I believe, going to be on the screen. There are all so many different versions of the Lord's Prayer, and this would be the New International Version of the Lord's Prayer. And shall we remember that prayer is communing with God. Okay? In this case, it's my sharing. In your case, you may want to take some time and share some of your thoughts and prayers with God on this special day. Father God, eternal God, from the beginning when this world started till the time that it may end, a God of power, a God of mercy. We well remember the hymn writer Isaac Watts penned these words, "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come." Our hope. You, O God, perhaps are our only hope. Your intervention, whatever way that may take. In the many years of leadership in our countries, O God, Canada, the United States, many other countries have turned away from you in their leadership. Not just in our schools, but in our courts of justice, in our legislative bodies. We are no longer to be able to say the Lord's Prayer, or to be able to mention your name, O God. And in general, we leave you out of our lives and out of our daily plans. In your holy scriptures, you tell us through the prophet Jeremiah, God speaking, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. O God, you tell us in the same portion of Scripture, when you call upon me and come and pray to me, I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. Today, O God, we are calling upon you and asking your guidance, asking your help in the planning and prospering of our wonderful nation. We are in desperate need of good leadership. Need we say more? Please guide us in this pursuit. This day, our Father, we remember those young men and women who have died, given their lives in the pursuit of freedom. Freedom we enjoy every day, all of the freedoms. Previous wars during the past century and more, as well as causes like those in Ukraine and Iran, are so needless. We know, God, you created us, and your plans will be worked out for this nation of ours, as well as throughout the world. We thank you for the lineup of speakers that you've gathered together for us in these 2 days. We know it's hard not to look back at where we've been, both in Alberta and in Canada, these past few years. But we ask, O God, that you would bring us hope and inspire us and challenge us as we look forward in the coming year. The challenges are great. The challenges are great, but with positivity and your guidance, O God, we choose to make 2023 Canada's greatest year. We ask these things in the mighty name of Jesus, who taught us, as we say, to pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Bob Smith. Yes, somehow I've got in the habit of calling Bob Mills, which is, once you get it in your mind, it's crazy. But anyway, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Colonel Redman, for leading the first part of this. We have, is Kelly, Kelly Lorenz, we have another veteran here. He's got his things on. Thanks for joining us, Kelly, for the service, and of course, I hope you stay all day. So, Colonel Redman, we're back to you again. Your turn.
Okay, remember the part about the laughing and the fun? That's what comes now. Let's start with the fact that when Danny asked me to come here, and Andrew, I need to steal part of your lines. Danny always gives you a title 3 months before the conference, and then the one that you get 2 weeks before the conference is completely different. So let me be very clear, you're going to get the one that Danny asked me to give 3 months ago. All right, so somewhere. I think the clicker went for a, oh, there it is, went for a trip. All right, so this is Danny's new title. It's a great title. It's not what I'm going to talk about. That's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about when a young man or woman decides to join the Canadian Armed Forces, whether it be Army, Navy, Air Force, they join probably really young and making a commitment they don't fully understand. And somewhere along the line, they get a spouse, in my case a beautiful wife, who didn't really know what she was signing up for. And to be fair, I married her after I was already in the Army, so she can't claim that I switched gears on her. But let's talk about what's life like as a family with a service member. So first I need to define to you what Jen and I, we did this together, what Jen and I define as a family. Okay? And everybody's definition of a family, you've seen the UN's versions, you've seen other people's. This is ours. Step one, there's got to be love. And when you're young and you're crazy and you see the most beautiful woman you've ever met in your life and she actually talks to you, that's a really good thing, right? And so that love starts off in one way and it evolves over the 50 years we've been together and becomes different, deeper, and better. But without that cornerstone, no family can exist. Frequently the love breaks and everything that follows falls to pieces. In our definition, there's marriage. It's a contract for life. It's a deal you make with each other that no matter how good or how bad things get, you're going to ride them out. And sometimes you won't see eye to eye, and sometimes you'll go at it tooth and nail, and other times it's like you're just drifting on a cloud, and it's a lot of fun, right? But marriage is part of the contract to build a family. Without marriage, without that commitment, the rest can just simply dissolve. Trust and support. You'll see as I go through the presentation what it means to be a spouse of a soldier, but trust and support through everything. Both directions, between husband and wife, between husband, wife, and children, and the children back, is what the whole family unit's about. That there will always be a safe place. My children grew up in a house where I told them constantly, outside that door, fear doesn't exist. Inside this door, fair will always exist. So if the three of you are going to have a knockdown, drag 'em out fight, at the end of the day, fairness will be resolved in here. But don't ever expect that out there. That's not how the world works. You need to be able to bounce when you hit the ground, okay? So we had lots of discussions, but between the two of us, if something a child did in our family, each of us saw through different lenses, we sorted that out offline, and then presented a united front to our children, so that they had the security of knowing that mom and dad weren't playing one off against the other. And so obviously I got to children. Now, what you see on the left side of that children is what we used to call, whenever I wrote people, I always said, from Dave, Goldilocks, and the three bears. Because they were always little bears to me, the littlest bear being the baby in that picture, my daughter Donna, who's now in her mid-40s. And she still likes to be called the littlest bear because, after all, she was last, therefore best. We finally got it right. But as they grow, so does the family grow. And the picture you see on the right is us with spouses of our children and with all of our 6 grandchildren. And that picture I used intentionally because Scarlett, one of my grandchildren, for Christmas said, I don't want any gifts. I want a family photo taken at the Old West studio. That's my gift. Take the money you would have put into my presents. I want this photo for all time. So that's why that photo exists. Now, of course, grandparents being grandparents, we didn't have to abide by our wish, so she got presents from Granny and Grandpa, from Nana and Grandpa, but her mom said, okay, that's a choice. And she honored that choice, and there was no gift under the tree other than a framed copy of that picture. Because the grandchildren bought into the trust and support, the love, and the complete family unit. And do to this day. They're all now in university and senior high school, grade 11 and 12. And they're really close, but we'll get to that more. But the fifth piece of a family is dreams. And the family as a unit builds dreams. First it was just Jen and I. And in Beacon Hill Park, before we were married, we used to spend 3 hours in Victoria when I was at Royal Roads Military College, and I'd pick her up and I was dead broke. An officer cadet earned $40 a month. She earned $220 a month. We didn't have money to do anything. So we'd go sit in Beacon Hill Park and we would talk for 3 hours. Drug dealers came up to us offering us drugs. We told them we didn't have any money. They left pretty quick. But this is back in the very early 70s, and we just talked about what our family was going to look like. How many kids did we want? Where did we want to live? What we were going to do with our lives? What was the most important thing? What movie did we see last week? We built dreams that were still ticking off the list, all right, to this day. And we still have those discussions to this day. What are we going to do next? Where are we going next? How does it fit? So that's our definition of a family. Yours will be different. That was ours. So let's talk about the Canadian Army. I was already in the Army. What you see on the top left, the Army constantly is training. Always training, which meant the service member is always away. You're preparing for something, even if you don't know what the something is yet. You do general purpose training, and then you do role-specific training when you get a mission. Sovereignty of Canada. We had this discussion last night. What's the role of the Canadian Armed Forces? Number 1, sovereignty of Canada. Number 2, sovereignty of North America. Number 3, defense in our alliances like NATO. Number 4, down in the middle, you see support to Canadians in domestic operations, fires, floods, tornadoes. But you also see our commitments to the UN, and you see our commitment to security operations like right now in support of Ukraine. And in the middle, you see deployments for war. Those are pictures from going to Afghanistan and other sort of horrible places. So what does that mean for a family? The Army has 3 priorities that the Army defines and demands. Number 1 is mission, 24/7. The mission is overall. As a soldier, I knew at a moment's notice during the Cold War, the sirens would go off at 4:30 in the morning in every small town in Germany, and we would run for our equipment and we would deploy immediately to the East German or Czechoslovakian border. My family were on their own. Tough. We ran. We got our rifles, our ammunition, and we left. Mission first. Always first. Soldiers second. Now, that's a little tiny photograph, but that was my command as a major. I then went on to have 3 commands as a colonel, and they were 5 to 7 times larger than that. But the little tiny dot you see, right, you can't even see it. Dead center, front, 3 paces in front of everybody else, that's me. But every one of those soldiers that stood behind me was my second priority. The minute I knew I could achieve my mission, those soldiers and their families were my number 1 mission. I had to make sure that every one of those families that supported every one of those soldiers was good, because a soldier that has a broken family is a broken soldier and can't fight. So my job and my wife's job as we went up in rank was to help those families. When I went away, that meant my soldiers went away. That meant they left behind spouses who needed help. We always left a rear party, but her job changed. Not her children, all their children. Okay? The third priority is self, and that's not to be self-fulfilling. That means I constantly had to train myself. I had to make sure my ethics were always up to date, that my physical training was up to date, so that my brain could function and my body wouldn't let me down at the worst moment, and that my intellectual property was up to date. In other words, I was best at tactics. I knew how to command my soldiers and defeat the enemy in every single way of our mission. And then way down the bottom is family. But that doesn't mean they're forgotten. that means they know they're fourth. Unfortunately, that's the way it worked. And I can tell you stories about soldiers and supporting them, coming home from an exercise and two soldiers calling me one after another saying their houses were empty and all that they were calling me on was the telephone, which was the only thing left in their house because their spouse had left while we were away, took all the furniture, their children, and everything. And I just had a brand new baby, my oldest, and I dropped everything and I went and helped them for 2.5 days, and Jennifer didn't see me, and neither did our new baby. Danger, the second thing. The job is dangerous. I showed you my dog tags. I wore them all the time. That has an impact on your spouse. That has an impact on your children. They know every time you walk out that door to get on a plane to go somewhere really, really bad, you may not come back. And that impacts them. During the Cold War in Germany, that happened every single month. We did snowballs every month, and nobody ever knew if they were real or not until we came home. Frequent moves, and you might get a chuckle out of this one, but every time you move, your spouse gives up their career, the family is impacted, your children and all their friends, they lose them and they have to restart. And just so you understand, that impacts schooling for your kids. My son did 11 different schools in 12 years of secondary education, from grade 1 to grade 12. He did it in 11 schools spread over 3 different countries. The family unit has to be strong to help the children through those changes, but it builds very resilient children. And if you wonder how many moves we did, this is how many times we moved in my career. 27 years. A star means I went by myself and my family was without me for an extended period of time longer than 3 months. But no star means the whole family stepped up, packed up everything in our house, and went somewhere different. And you see, we went to Germany 3 times, we went to the United States once, we went all over Canada, and every time, schooling stopped, packed up, moved, children lost all their friends, and we went through the drill to reestablish a house. Prolonged absences, all through my career. At the end of my career, my clerks gave my wife a medal with a framed scroll for being the most understanding Army wife in the Canadian Forces, because they proved from records alone, which meant it was more than that I had averaged 4.5 months away from home every year for 27 years. Completely gone from my home. So you know who raised 3 wonderful kids. She's sitting right there. 4.5 months minimum a year away from home. And in those pictures, you can see a lot of them were in pretty yucky places. But then there's public versus private life. I ended up being a colonel for 9 years at the end of my career, but long before that, as an officer cadet, you see me walking beside the Governor General of Canada inspecting the troops at Royal Roads. Anything your family does, and I mean by family, I mean extended family. My brother asked me once when I was a major whether or not he could go to a conference in Russia. He's a physicist and an astronomer, and he was invited to a conference in Moscow in the middle of the Cold War, and I said, no, you can't. But yeah, you can, but it means the end of my top secret security clearance forever and the end of my career. So he chose not to go. So it didn't just affect my little family unit, it extended my family unit. My kids said to me the worst thing that they could do when they were teenagers, and we were in Germany for the 3rd time, and they were all in high school and junior high, their biggest terror was that they would do something that would disappoint me because it would affect my career. So don't think that every day my position didn't directly impact their decisions in everything they did. So that's what it's like to be a family in the Army, and I go back to the 5 steps of our cornerstone that these are the things that have held our family together. My 2 daughters live 3 doors and 4 doors down from us. The 2 daughters live side by side, and my son lives 15 minutes away in town. We sit 14 for dinner every Sunday in our house, because that life that we lived together made us a family unit to take on the world. And we discuss with our grandchildren at Sunday dinners what's affecting their lives. We have great rolling discussions around board games from 2 o'clock till 3 o'clock. We laugh, we share, we talk about what's going on, because without that family unit, I would have never survived, and I'm pretty sure she wouldn't have either. So I thank you very much. And that's what's life like in a soldier, and that really is why we fight. Okay? We fight for our families, and those that are with us, and those that aren't with us. Thank you very much.
I think you might as well stay here. I don't think the questions will be for me. Yes? Yes, Mattea, are you there?
No, you have to give it back.
How do I get her back?
Text her.
Oh, text her, okay.
No, come back.
Okay. Mattea, please come home. When I sent, just a second. Come back online. When there we are. Is that her? Hi, Mattea, are you there? Here we are. When I thought I asked David to talk about, we fight not because we, hate what's in front of us, we love what's behind us, and John said, well, that was Chesterton said that, and I said, I thought I'd thought of that. So anyway, hello, Mattea. You're back, and we have, did you hear Colonel Redman? Were you able to see that? Were you able to hear Colonel Redman? Yes, exactly. So does anybody have any questions? John, are you coming up to ask a question? Yes. Sure. John's going to come and ask the first question. Go ahead. Yeah. Anybody else that John has special privileges, but anyone else, there's a mic there. You'll also be on camera, so if you want to ask a question, you can go to the mic and ask the question to either of our speakers or John.
I just wanted to explain the reason the topics always change is that I do the agenda and it has to fit on one line. I actually, when I used to work at the Ottawa Citizen, I had a part-time gig doing headlines for them, so I'm a fanatic for headlines that fit. It's all got to fit on 2 pages. So it doesn't matter what you're really going to say, although it's always nice if there's some perceptible resemblance between the two. But no, I wasn't coming up to ask a question. I have tried the audience's patience quite enough, so we're opening it to the floor now.
Are you coming to ask a question, Kevin, or no? No, okay, well,
Peacefully.
I'll ask a question. Do you think, how hard would it be to get rid of the United Nations, and should we?
Well, I'm assuming that one question is for me. It would be an interesting feat to get rid of the United Nations. There's only one benefit to it that I currently see, and that is the fact that it is a safe ground per se for everybody across the world to come and deliberate, to have negotiations in a place where conflict it's not a chamber, it's a political chamber. It's not a place for heated discussions as in terms of what you would see online. It is a private sphere, but I do believe that it would be very difficult at this point to get rid of the United Nations. At the same time, I think there's critical steps that nations who are adamantly opposed to the UN's agendas, I think there's critical steps they could take to remove themselves from the UN. We look at President Donald Trump, he took various steps to ensure that specific funding wasn't going towards policy agendas of the United Nations and their counterparts, philanthropists who work alongside them. He ensured that funding, American taxpayers' dollars, weren't going towards those specific agenda items. Now, I think it would be more so of a question of how untangled can we actually become as nations away from the United Nations, because so much of our policy is entangled with the UN. So I think if we reduced our funding or got rid of all of our taxpayer funding towards the UN as individual nations, and then on top of that dismantled a lot of the legislation currently in place that is entangled with UN policy, I think that would be the first step towards dismantling the UN.
Colonel Redman, do you want to comment on that? And then we have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
As a soldier, I did a whole series of UN tours in my career. And there's Chapter 7 and Chapter 6 from a military point of view. Chapter 7 is where all the countries agree, and they want to have a timeout so that they can supposedly have peace negotiations. Chapter 6 is where you try and impose a peace settlement on countries. And if you go back to the establishment of the UN Charter, it was to stop things like genocide, which were Chapter 6. You were going to go in and tell a nation how to behave. In my opinion, there has only been one successful Chapter 7 UN military deployment, and there have been no successful Chapter 6 deployments. The United Nations as a body to try and encourage world stability, in my opinion, from the point of view of warfighting, has been a complete disaster. The only one that worked was UNEF-2, United Nations Emergency Force 2, in the Sinai Desert following the 73 war, and the Camp David Peace Accord that resulted from that in 1979 still stands to this day between Egypt and Israel. But the whole concept behind the UN isn't that sovereign countries give up their rights. The political concept behind it is to find agreement on issues where countries could collaborate. Collaboration has been taken, as we saw in the previous presentation, to an entirely unintended level. And we saw the death and destruction of the League of Nations. The United Nations was formed in 1947. That was a long time ago. And so we're talking 60 years. And there has been no world war to reestablish a better structure, and I'm afraid short of a world war, the structure we've got is going to continue to spin out of control, but that's just my opinion.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one problem with the United Nations is its name, right? Because it implies that they either are or should be united in what they're trying to do. And there's a great line from Bertrand Juvenal at a Liberty Fund conference where he said as a young man, he believed in one world government until he crossed the Swiss border half an hour ahead of the Nazis. And if we could get clear that the UN is a place where nations meet to discuss their disagreements and do their best not to get into catastrophic wars over them, that would be kind of useful. But the idea that it's a world government, that it expresses the best that we have thought and said and done, well, if that's true, we're in a bad way. But it does have another advantage of the UN is at least it gets it all in one place where you can see it. So there's some value when the UN gets together and creates all these schemes that you rightly denounce. You know, it does have the virtue that we see what they're thinking and planning, and that's actually helpful in planning your response.
Gordon, go ahead.
I would like to ask,
I don't know if your mic's on. Is the mic on?
I can hear him.
Oh, you can hear him? Okay, she can hear you, and she's the one who has to answer, so that's good, yeah.
Are you an advocate for school vouchers?
I am an advocate for school vouchers. I'm an advocate for school choice. So any way that you can make it so that parents have full control of how their children are going to be raised and how their children are going to be educated, I see vouchers as a credible way of ensuring that parents have the ultimate decision of how their children are going to get educated.
Have they ever been implemented in a place where you respect the system?
There are a few places. There are a few places in the United States, a few states that do have voucher systems in place. It's a little more new and nuanced even. So I would wait at least 5 years to see how things are turning out for families. And I haven't specifically looked at the data with regards to a 5-year time frame. But I would say there's a few states in the US that have done it recently, as there's been a sweeping of both homeschooling and school choice movements that have taken the country by storm. So I'm personally going to wait at least 5 years to see when the data comes out, but I am in favor of them.
Thank you.
Doug, go ahead.
Hello, Mattea. I have a question about the mechanism of compliance that forces Canada to go along with these SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, and Agenda 2030. I mean, the idea of limiting global conflict seems reasonable. at the founding of the UN. And it's probably got the article wrong. It might be 6 or possibly 7 of the UN Charter. Article says something to the effect that, nothing in this charter would compel a member nation from anything that would be rightly termed to be a domestic or sovereign issue. So when Trudeau takes up these things and does them, is it not a voluntary thing that we could get out of, at least based on that clause? And how tightly are we wrapped into this mess?
Great, that's a fantastic question. You know your stuff. Yes, so there's both what we call binding and non-binding documents at the UN. So for a binding document, you are legally implicated in fulfilling your role, or if you sign on to a clause, or if you sign on to a specific UN document. And within that document, there are certain protocols that you are meant to follow as a nation with regards to following through with, let's say, a piece of national legislation. You have a legal obligation to fulfill that. But there's so many non-binding documents that come out of the UN that different governments like Trudeau's signs onto, and the perception that different governments put out there is that when they sign on to these documents, they put out there that we are now bound to these. They are not. And because of that article in the founding document of the UN, it gives an out for nations, because one of the major issues that I deal with at the UN is actually trying to protect national sovereignty. And there are several clauses, articles, actually documents fighting for national sovereignty published at the United Nations that they themselves don't hold themselves to. So the mechanism is really if it's a legal document or if it's not. And then what they end up doing with non-binding documents, these governments, including Trudeau's, is they will refer back to these different documents they signed on to that are not legal obligations for them to fulfill, and use those as justification for whatever they're pushing via national policy. So I hope that makes sense, but it all comes down to if it's a binding or non-binding document.
Thank you, Mattea. You want to comment on that? Yes, go ahead.
Not specifically to the question, but the United Nations was overtaken by the Cold War by 1965. So let's understand that any vote taken by all the member countries in the United Nations isn't a free vote. For the first sort of 20 years between 65 to the wall coming down in 89, Russia controlled a whole bunch of countries directly by injecting money and weapons. The United States controlled a whole bunch of countries by injecting money and weapons. And so we had this Cold War standoff, and all those countries voted for whatever the United States wanted or Russia wanted. There was no need for the UN Security Council to veto stuff because they would build this standoff. The Cold War ended when the wall came down, but China in the last 15 years has replaced all of that. China now directly funds and controls the governments in at least 40 African countries and dictates to them how they will vote. They own almost all the Caribbean countries, all of which are worth one vote. They also control many, many of the Southeast Asia countries, again, directly by money and promises and guarantees. So if we think that these policies that are forthcoming are free and open discussion between all of those nation states, were wrong. They're being told what to put forward, how to put it forward in return for another bunch of fishing boats in San Lucia or a new highway in Jamaica. If you've traveled the world, you've seen for the last 15 years China investing in this infrastructure to hundreds of billions of dollars. In return, they dictate how those countries vote in the UN, and the whole agenda has turned.
And if I may, just on that point, the same thing is happening, especially Africa. There's a heavy focus, intensifying actually in Africa with regards to Chinese control. And we've seen that actually happen with regards to the swaying of African votes, the African voting bloc at the UN. And even the ultimate, it's not just the outside influence of China affecting UN votes, it's actually inside as well. So China has taken over, many of their bureaucrats have taken over various key positions in the UN, and that's one thing we're keeping an eye on because of the bent of the CCP at this point in time.
And there's also a peculiar constitutional point here. I didn't bring my books and DVDs, because you all know where to find them if you have any desire to do so, but
Might as well give them the web address.
yeah, I mean, it's just, it's johnrobson.ca, so if you can remember that, you can order them, and if you can't, you might struggle with the ordering process as well. But does the Prime Minister of Canada have the authority, by signing a document at the UN, to override the Canadian Parliament? Well, obviously he doesn't, right? This is a very peculiar thing for him to be doing. And I'm reminded of there's an old thing that came up in Britain between sort of Magna Carta and the Henry VIII's break with Rome, where all British politicians, including the monarch, were Catholic. So nominally they had to do what the Pope would tell them to do. And periodically the Pope would order the king to do something, and the king would say, gee, I'm a good Catholic and I'd love to, but I'm not allowed to entrench on the privileges of Parliament. So then the Pope would order the MPs to do it, and they'd say, well, gee, we're all good Catholics and we'd love to help you out, but we are constitutionally forbidden from entrenching on the privileges of the monarch, so you're out of luck, go jump in the Tiber, right? And so, if the UN tells us to do something and we don't, what are they going to do? Because the final thought is from that guy in the Ballad of Buster Scruggs cocking a six-gun and saying, and if and I don't? We don't have to do what the UN tells us. I suppose they could fire nuclear weapons at us, but it's improbable. It's a scam to suggest that because the Prime Minister goes and signs something he wouldn't dare put in front of Parliament, Parliament is now irrelevant and we have to do it. But if we, again, if we put up with it, then it's going to happen. But it has zero constitutional or geopolitical standing, and we just have to say no.
Paul Himmon's going to be speaking later tonight, and I'd be disappointed if he didn't bring up recall, but I think recall is another one of those things. It's sort of like public hangings, like when your name's on the list, it sort of focuses your attention. Michelle?
I think to some extent you might have answered my question, but recently there was a new report issued by the high-level expert group of the UN, led by Catherine McKenna. And Catherine McKenna is the former Environment and Climate Change Minister for Canada, and this expert group has tried to decide how to implement mandatory laws against greenwashing. And the report is full of non-stop recommendations of how to impose mandatory reporting on corporations and how that people can be punished or corporations can be punished for not properly reporting. And of course, if you're doing full-scale reporting as a corporation, you're actually giving industrial espionage to your competitor nations or to competitor countries, because you're telling them exactly what you need, what you use, where it goes. So this can be used against you by environmental groups, as we've seen, can be used against you by competitor nations, by competitors within blocks of the country itself. So again, I'm wondering to what extent these people in this report has any influence in Canada, because all these people are unelected, they're unaccountable, they were appointed by, I believe, Antonio Guterres, but beyond that, also none of the people on the list have any, say, engineering expertise, so they're not very high level and they're not very expert. Over to you.
Yes, so I'm not very familiar with the specific report that you're referring to, but you've piqued my interest and I will go look into that report specifically. But you are correct, these are unelected bureaucrats at the end of the day. And like I said previously, the influence that they have is that they can make these recommendations, and then governments will take those recommendations, refer back to them as justification when they're writing legislation. So I'll keep my answer the same. But it is true, as John said, as long as you buck the trend of just going along with the flow and you choose to say no, like countries like Poland and Hungary, who are bucking the trend both with the UN and the EU, they come under constant fire, but nonetheless their GDP is growing, and the state of the family is improving dramatically. So I'll leave it there. If anybody else on speaking the panel would like to answer that, if they have more knowledge on that specific report, I'd love to hear.
I would say it's exactly the same as we saw in COVID. There was a judge just last week, made the ruling that an elected cabinet of the government of Alberta did not have the right to overturn a regulation from the MOH, Dina Henshaw, to impose masks in schools. And the judge said only a medical expert can make that ruling, and therefore the elected officials had no right to do anything other than what she told them. Now take that to the UN. Our own courts in Canada are telling us that the bureaucrat, and I was a bureaucrat my whole life, don't get me wrong, I know what good bureaucracy looks like, and we do have a whole ton of it. But that judge said the bureaucrat overrules the premier every time.
My favorite past national councillor from the Federal Conservative Party, Marilyn Elliott.
Thank you to my favorite director from Bakerville, Wainwright.
Thank you.
My question is for Colonel Redman. My late husband was an Army brat. His father was a Major General with the Patricias. And his record for schooling was he attended 21 schools in 18 years, to the extent that when he was in his final year of high school, he just said, "I'm not going." And he demanded that he live his last year of high school with his grandmother in Woodstock, Ontario. But he was so angry that he was moved so many times and had to go to that many different schools that he felt he could have sued the Department of Defense. And so my question to you is, did your children think that moving to that many schools in that many years was a positive thing, or not?
You'd have to ask them. But, knowing my kids, I think they did. And the reason being, they had a family unit that was solid as hell. And so when there was, I'll tell you a story of my oldest daughter. She was in grade 12 doing calculus, and I was in Bosnia in the middle of a pretty horrible war in 1995 with atrocities all around us. And we got a 23-minute satellite phone call home each week, one call per soldier each week. I used to routinely spend 20 minutes of the 23 minutes going through calculus problems with her because I had taken the same textbook with me into the theater of war, and she'd say, "Page 12, Dad." Okay, psh, 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 psh. That meant my wife and my other two kids got 1 minute each, and we would solve all those. You have to build a family unit where the kids know that no matter what, they're part of the decision. One more little story. We were in Montreal, and we never got 2-year postings. Every year was a 1-year posting. So we always found out in February where you were going next. And so my youngest daughter, who was in grade 3 at the time, February, she says to me, "So where are we going this summer, Dad?" And I said, "You know what, sweetheart? I think we're actually going to get a second year. Like, never happens. We're going to spend 2 years here." And she went, "Oh, no, Dad. No, where are we going? Seriously, now. That was fun. Now, where are we going?" I said, no, I'm positive we're staying 1 more year. We're not moving till this summer after. And she said, "That can't happen. You call the career manager." Now, think about this. This is a 9-year-old little girl says, "You call the career manager," she knows the system, "and you tell him we're moving." I looked at her. Jen looked at her. We both smiled. "What's going on, Donna?" She said, "I worked my butt off this year. I got the best marks I'm going to get in my whole life, and if we stay here, the teachers are going to expect me to do that again next year. You tell them we're moving." We tried to make every move an adventure. Every time we moved, it was an adventure. We would stay in places, we'd spend the afternoons in pools, we'd book motels along the way. Those were our holidays, right? The kids, they look forward to it. Going from Germany to California, all the different places we went, for them. And to this day, they say the education they got from where we lived was 10 times what they learned in school. So I think it's dependent on the family unit, it really is.
Go ahead.
Mine will be short and sweet, but out of desperation. I heard you explain how your family unit is, and I felt so convicted and almost envious. I wish I had that with my kids and my family. And I'm wondering, how do you get that? With today's day and age, with the influence all around them, we seem to be facing something completely different. What are tips that you guys have so that we can stray all these stray cats and be together a strong unit like you have to face on the world?
There's no silver bullet, but I'm happy that we don't have the distractions of these when we were raising our kids. When I got told, I was in Egypt after the 73 war, and I got a letter that took 2 weeks to get to me from my boss saying, I think you're posted the minute you get home. I got on a ham radio to get a shot back to Jennifer to say, I think we're posted. And in those days, ham radio, you had to flick the switch one way and the other way, right? So they flicked the switch to her, and she was in Calgary at the time. And I said, I think we're posted, over, flick. And she gets on, I know we're posted. They've been here assessing the house. We're packing the boxes. Where the hell are we going? What's going on? And she took a breath. And the operator in Edmonton, who had put the shot down to Calgary, said, Mrs. Redman, you need to say over when you're done. I'm not done. So from 8,000 kilometers away, we had this discussion. How do you make the family survive it? The kids never saw that, right? That wasn't the discussions we had in front of them. But as well, when the kids were really struggling and there was a move coming up, when we were in Toronto for 11 months, they made the best friends of their lives. We didn't play down the fact that they were leaving those friends, and they're still friends to this day. Some of those kids still fly out to Edmonton to see our kids. So there is no silver bullet, but it's that constant support and trust block. It's the ability for them to talk about anything, no matter how uncomfortable the conversation. My oldest daughter was brought home once so drunk she was impossible to wake up when she was 16 years old. I lay with her for the whole night on the kitchen floor with my hand on her shoulder to make sure she took a breath all night. I sent the other two kids away and my wife, and I waited till 3 o'clock in the morning when she woke up and threw up all over the kitchen floor. We cleaned it up together. She threw up again, and I put her to bed, and I said, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, we're going for a walk. And we walked up into the Black Forest, and we spent 2 hours nature hiking. We cried a lot. We hugged a lot. She understood how close she had come to killing herself. And it wasn't intentional. They were having fun running through the orchards, drinking schnapps. Shit happens. The picture I give you is one of a very solid family, but there was rough steps all along the way. There was crap happening. There was external influence. There was the mean kids. There was the good kids. There was trusting them to go on dates at 14 in Germany, where the legal age was 14, with Germans. Think about it. I was asked by the general if I would take my family for the third tour back to Germany to close all of Canadian Forces Europe, because everyone knew that teenage kids in Germany came home on drugs. My 3 didn't, because of our family unit. Because the pressure was immense. The pressure to have sex at the age of 14 on all of them was immense. How do you build it? Trust, support, constant conversation. When they screw up, it's okay. They're kids. They're supposed to screw up. Don't march them into the locker for 14 days. But there is consequences, all right? You lost your freedoms for a week. I don't trust you to go out until you can prove to me I can trust you to go out again. There's always got to be accountability, but there's no silver bullet, and every family's tough. Every family's tough. And these don't make it any easier, right? But your kids got to know they can talk to you about everything and anything. And my grandkids now, I retired early for personal reasons. I helped raise my grandkids, and my grandkids will tell me things, like most grandparents, that they would never tell to their parents, because I have that trust with them. So does she. We talk about things to help them through the social media and all that other crap. Our grandkids, it's not easy for them, but they're turning out pretty good. Every day's a struggle, but every day if you invest the time, and that's why we're having this conversation about family. What is family, and how do you build that? because every family unit ties together into a small community, ties together into a big community, and without it, we're nuked. So Nadine, to me, it's a really hard question because there is no one answer, because every family, you and your husband came from different backgrounds, right? So did we.
You want to comment on that? No? Grant, just 2 more questions, then it'll be lunchtime. Grant and then Wes. Go ahead, Grant.
Just a comment, Colonel Redman, taking me on a nature walk after I've been hammered, that would have killed me. Anyway, Mattea, nice to meet you. Now, I come from a financial background. I spent a couple of years as a broker, and I watched the financial things pretty close. And so we've got the UN with their agenda, and we've got the World Economic Forum with their agenda. They're very similar agendas, but the World Economic Forum is the elites that are looking to take this control over. How do their agendas jive? Are they in competition? Are they working together, or what's happening there?
Good question. Thank you, sir. They are working in conjunction with one another, and you look at the primary way you can figure that out is, one, what they project to the general population, but then also who is funding them. So they aren't necessarily at competition with each other. They do have some differences when it comes to cultural things. The UN tends to focus more on the culture, and as we're talking about, they have a heavy emphasis on family. But the World Economic Forum, I mean, they don't necessarily talk a lot about abortion, but they do talk about wanting to drive down the population numbers, which then you can kind of see it as a picture in your mind as they hand that portion off to the UN to do that kind of dirty work. But they're not in competition with one another. They work in conjunction, just like all the philanthropists who fund them and the various governments too.
Thank you. Quick question for Colonel Redman. We all love to hate Putin. We all think the Ukraine is wonderful, but I've read quite a bit of stuff talking about the Minsk agreement that was signed 10 years ago, or thereabouts, that it was an agreement between the UN, essentially the US, and Russia, saying they would not move missile bases any closer to Russia than what they were. They violated that for 10 years, 8 to 10 years. And the other thing, too, they were saying that the Ukrainian mafia and Ukrainian Nazis were bombing Donbass, killing people in Donbass, which is predominantly Russian, and that Putin finally got pressure from them and said enough is enough, and he attacked. He didn't attack like the press likes to tell us on a whim that he wanted the Ukraine, because I don't think he even wanted the Ukraine because it's such a cultural mess. Am I wrong in looking at it from that standpoint or not?
I would put it to you that there's mass disinformation on both sides, for very good reasons for both sides. But I need you to go back and remember who Mr. Putin is. He was a member of the KGB, the FSB, then he was the mayor of Moscow, and now he's been the single leader of Russia for quite some time. His stated objectives from 40 years ago was that Gorbachev was a traitor and he would personally rebuild the Soviet Union. He's never wavered from that aim and that objective, and the first step was an attempt into Afghanistan that went really bad. So he's turned his attention away from the Muslim countries, and he went for what he considered to be the softest country he could pick on, which was Ukraine, easiest to access, hoping to get Ukraine first, then Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, to get full access back to the Baltic, and then look at Poland. His stated aims haven't changed in 40 years. So while there's definitely fault on both sides, remember who Mr. Putin is.
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel Redman. Last question, Wes Taylor, go ahead and go ahead.
Thank you. My question, and I'm a data person, I like to understand things based on numbers. So my question is going to be for all three of the guests, Mattea, John, Colonel Redman, but we have the coronavirus, which is still going on. People are pushing for masks in places like Ontario and Quebec. There's been so many people that have been considered dead from coronavirus, yet they were in a car accident, or they were shot, or they had terminal illness with cancer or heart attacks. And all these numbers are being formed to help support, I think, the Imperial College's misguided high numbers that they initially started to do all the lockdowns on. What can we do to stop the madness is one of the questions, but the other one is, what can we do to hold both governments, the UN, WHO accountable for what they've done to both hurt the society, hurt our children, because the masks have stopped them from actually having the normal development. There's so many unintended consequences and consequences of the way they handled or mismanaged this whole coronavirus.
That's a really in-depth question. We'll go ladies first. That extra time that we had is long since gone. So Mattea, 1 minute, please.
For sure. So I would say for your first question, to expose it. Do your part. We have given so much information, not just national or even state or provincial information. We're given global information. And whenever you're given that breadth of information, don't just attack it from that perspective of, I just have to share this with everyone and anyone. Focus in on your sphere of influence. What you learn, the person next door might not know. So build relationships with your community and inform your family. So start, if something's happening globally, start locally and share the information that way and expose it. With regards to your second question, I'd say engage. The way you defeat this thing, and it's not just this thing, it's anything, you have to be willing to engage and put your neck out there and be willing to meet with politicians. I worked in a parliamentary office, and then I worked with a cabinet minister in the province of Saskatchewan. And the people we took the most credibly wasn't the person who called us and screamed at us every day. Those were hard phone calls. It was a person who was informed before they came in, requested a meeting, came in and sat down with us and informed us on what was happening and their concerns. Because when there's a face, even psychologically, if you understand, if you study psychology, you understand that face-to-face personal connection where you feel the emotions of the individual and you look into their eyes and you see what they're feeling, that does leaps and bounds for your movement and even for the cause that you're fighting for. Now, when it comes to the UN, I was hoping I had the opportunity to say this because it's a concept that nobody ever talks about, and just as you would lobby a politician, I would encourage you to lobby your bureaucrats that are appointed by Trudeau to go to the United Nations. And all you have to do is look up the station, actually the Canadian Bureau at the United Nations, and you can actually lobby them as well via email and phone. And it's something that nobody talks about, but it's incredibly important that people start doing it, because they aren't ever held accountable for the actions they're taking, especially when it comes to detracting from what are true Canadian values. So that would be my input at this point.
Thank you, Mattea. Colonel Redman, she used about 30 seconds of your 1 minute.
I apologize, sir.
I want to be as quick as I can. 2 bullets. Number 1, the only way to get accountability is to get a premier to walk back the lies. 2 lies that all Canadians believe, not all, 65% of Canadians, I know I said 60% last night, sorry. 65% of Canadians believe lockdowns work, vaccines were the only way out. Both are categoric lies. The response that you saw in Sweden was exactly what we had planned to do in Canada. The use of non-pharmaceutical interventions. Lockdown wasn't even a word 3 years ago. There are 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions. 2 of them should have been used for this virus. We used 12 of them. You can't talk about the terrible effects of the MPIs. We knew about them 3 years ago, what they would be. You have to talk that the response was wrong. The only way to do that is a premier has to walk it back. Without accountability, Canadians will go to their deathbeds believing lockdowns work, vaccines were the only way out. I need one premier. I'm hopeful in Alberta.
And I'm going to say, as I so often do here, suaviter in modo and fortiter in re, right? Be absolutely firm on the substance of what was done wrong, how we know it was done wrong, and how we should learn from that. But don't come across as angry. Don't come across as needing a tinfoil hat. Use humor. Rely upon people who know what they're talking about, including people like Matt Ridley, somebody you should all be following. And as for getting, accountability, I'm not looking for revenge on my enemies. What I really want to see is a repentant sinner up in the pulpit. To get some of the people who push this stuff strongly to be in public saying, you know what, we were wrong, here's how and why we were wrong, here's what to do differently next time. Let's win them over so it doesn't happen again, and we'll let God sort out the sins of our enemies and also of ourselves, because there could be issues on both sides with that one.
One last.
Sure, yeah.
If you haven't read it, please read Canada's Deadly Response to COVID-19 by David Redman on Frontier Centre for Public Policy. It was written 1st of July, 2021, and it lays out exactly why, all the evidence, what we did was wrong.
Thank you. Could we have a warm round of applause for all of our participants? Mattea, thank you very much. Of course, you're welcome to stay and listen for the rest of the day, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and I wish you were here to have lunch with us, but sadly you're not, so we'll talk to you after lunch. I'm going to ask David Strong to come up, and he's actually going to go to the speaker's microphone and ask the blessing so that everybody gets to see him online. David has been doing our communication, and if there's any good news that has come out of COVID, it's how well we've, I say we, meaning David, has improved the technology to present this way. And in the last few years, even when I was speaking, I would have to look at the screen to see what you were saying, Mattea, but now he has a big screen TV in front of the podium here, so I can sit and look at you as easily as if you were in the room. So it's really a tribute to David. So we're just going to, David, we'll ask you to come up and, there, now he's moving the camera, but you can come up here and ask the blessing, and then we'll have lunch, and shortly after we've had lunch, we're going to have Mark Morano present from, well, he did the video in Egypt. He's flying home as we speak, but he said, I sort of let it all hang out in Egypt, so I think he was over there watching all our pampered elites spend our money, so I gather he'll be in a mad mood, or in a bad mood and on a real rant, but I'm looking forward to it after lunch. So come on up, David. Okay, she's going to end the stream, okay.
You want me to say the prayer on the screen?
Yeah, I think you should. I mean, the people at home are probably waiting to have lunch too. We might as well pray for them as well.
It smells good. Our Father in heaven, we give thanks that we have people that have information, truth, that they can share and help us understand better this world and how we can make it a better place. And we give thanks for this food. Please bless it for us. And we end this session and start this lunch in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think the food's ready. We can line up. Let's eat. We'll get going. David, we'll put on the thing. I guess Mark Morano will be presenting at 12:30, so we've got just under half an hour for lunch. Thank you very much for an interesting morning.